Elder Gods Explained. The full lore of the Slavic Leshy and the Irish Tuatha de Danann. The world you inhabit is but the latest layer in a history of forgotten ages. Before the maps were drawn, before the empires of men carved their names into stone, before the comforting laws of science sought to explain away the darkness, our reality was more fluid. The veil between what was seen and unseen was thin, and in the twilight of that ancient world, great powers walked the earth. They were not all gods, nor were they all monsters. They were the primal consciousness of the land itself, the embodied souls of the forest, the sea, and the sky. They were entire pantheons whose laughter could shake the mountains, and whose sorrow could cause the rains to fall for a century. Their laws were not those of men, but of magic, of nature, and of blood. They waged wars that reshaped the cosmos, and they loved with a passion that birthed new races. But ages turn. The world changes. And as the age of humanity dawned, these elder powers faced a fate worse than a warrior's death. They faced obsolescence. They were driven to the margins of the world, pushed into the shrinking forests, forced into the hollow hills, or banished to the depths of our own folklore. They faded, but they did not vanish entirely. They left behind echoes, imprints on the soul of the land, and whispers in the stories we tell our children in the dark. Welcome to the Eldritch Codex. Our purpose here is to sift through the wreckage of myth and memory, to find the stories of these lost powers, and to understand the truths they represent. Part 1. The Leshy Explained. The forest spirit who plays games with your sanity. Before the age of empires, before the stone of the first cities was laid, before the written word sought to tame the chaos of memory, humanity existed in a world that was not yet its own. We were guests, trespassers in a realm that belonged to elder, wilder things. The world was a tapestry woven from two threads. The flickering firelight of the human settlement, a tiny, fragile spark of order and warmth, and the vast, impenetrable darkness of the woods that surrounded it. This was the primordial forest. And we must be clear, this was not the managed woodlands or tranquil parks we know today. This was a living entity, a world unto itself. Imagine a continent shrouded in a single unbroken canopy, a cathedral of ancient wood whose vaulted ceilings stole the light of the sun. Imagine trees so broad that a dozen men holding hands could not encircle their trunks, their roots delving into the earth like the fingers of sleeping giants. This was a place of profound, unnerving silence, a quiet so absolute it had weight, broken only by the sudden, inexplicable snap of a twig, the distant howl of a wolf, or the cry of a bird that sounded disturbingly like a human scream. This was the living labyrinth of shadow and moss, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and slow decay, where the paths shifted like the whims of a sleeping god, and where the seasons were not marked by calendars, but by the subtle change in the forest's breath. To the ancient Slavic peoples who lived upon its edge, huddled in small clearings carved from this immense wilderness, the forest was the very axis of existence. It was both larder and grave, a generous mother and a terrifying unseen predator. It was the source of all life and the wellspring of a profound existential dread. They knew, with a certainty born of generations of experience, that when you stepped from the sunlit safety of your village and beneath the boughs of the ancient oaks and pines, you were crossing a tangible border. You were no longer under the jurisdiction of human laws, or the protection of village chieftains. You were subject to an older, more capricious authority. You had entered the domain of a king. You had entered the domain of the Leshy. Today our journey takes us deep into the heart of that Slavic wilderness, back through the centuries, to confront a being as old as the trees themselves. An entity that is at once a god and a demon, a shepherd and a hunter, a guardian of the natural world and a malevolent trickster who delights in fraying the very edges of human sanity. This is not merely a monster to be slain, but a fundamental force of nature to be understood. A spirit whose laughter echoes in the rustling leaves, and whose anger can topple ancient trees. We will explore the tragedies and the terrors, the pacts and the punishments, that define the legacy of the Forest Lord. This is the story of the Leshy, the spirit who plays games with your mind. To truly comprehend the Leshy, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that birthed him. We must attempt to feel in our very bones what it was to live encircled by that great green ocean. For the early Slavs, the forest was not a backdrop. It was the entire stage upon which the drama of life and death unfolded. From the forest came the straight-grained pine that formed the walls of their longhouses, the sturdy oak that burned in the hearth and held back the suffocating cold of the long winter nights. From its shaded floor came the mushroom, some a life-saving feast, others a swift and agonizing poison, and only the wisdom of the elders could tell them apart. Its tangled thickets yielded berries that stained the fingers of children and sweetened their meager diet. Its hidden glades nurtured the herbs that could break a fever, soothe a wound, or ease a difficult childbirth. The forest was a constant, tangible provider. Its bounty was the difference between a winter of starvation and a spring of survival. To hunt within its depths was to seek life itself, to track the deer and the boar that would feed the village for another week. The forest was, in the most literal sense, the giver of life. But for every gift it gave, the forest presented a threat. For every deer there was a wolf. For every sun-dappled glade, there were 1,000 acres of lightless, disorienting gloom. The very same forest that provided the wood for the cradle also held the bear that could crush a man's skull with a single blow. The rustle of leaves that might be a harmless squirrel could just as easily be the silent tread of a predator. The greatest danger of all, however, was not the fang or the claw, but the forest itself. Its sheer, indifferent vastness. Every man, woman, and child knew the stories. Tales of experienced hunters who had gone out for an afternoon and never returned. Of children who had wandered just a few feet from the edge of the clearing to pick flowers, only to vanish without a trace. The terror of being lost was a primal, immediate fear. It was the chilling realization that the familiar path you walked yesterday had inexplicably vanished today. It was the dawning horror of seeing the same strangely bent tree for the third time, understanding with a cold knot of dread in your stomach that you were walking in circles, a prisoner of the woods. It was the way the setting sun would turn the shadows into menacing, grasping claws, the way the silence would press in, making you imagine whispers just at the edge of hearing. The forest that gave life could take it away with terrifying ease, not through violence, but through simple, silent, maddening disorientation. When a force in your world is this powerful, this central to your existence, when it is both your greatest provider and your most profound threat, the human mind does something remarkable. Seeks to understand, seeks to negotiate. It gives that force a name, a face, and a will. You cannot reason with a blizzard, but you can make an offering to the spirit of winter. You cannot bargain with a plague, but you can pray to a god of healing. And you cannot plead with a million square miles of disorienting woodland, but you can try to appease its master. This is the psychological womb from which the Leshy was born. He is the answer to the fundamental question that every person who lived on the edge of the wilderness must have asked. Who is in charge here? Who governs the migration of the beasts? Who decides which paths are safe and which lead to doom? Who is this immense, breathing consciousness that surrounds us? The answer was the Leshy. He was not a spirit who happened to live in the forest like a man lives in a house. The belief was far more profound, far more elemental. In a very real sense, he was the forest. His name itself is the key. The word Leshy is derived directly from the Old Slavic word les, meaning forest. He is, quite literally, the forest one. He is the forest will made manifest, its soul given form, its power concentrated into a single conscious entity. He is the nervous system of the wilderness, feeling the footfall of every creature, the axe bite in every tree, the passing of every season. He is the embodiment of the forest's absolute, terrifying indifference to human morality. The forest does not care if you are a good man or a wicked one. It does not distinguish between saint and sinner. It operates on a different, older set of principles, strength, cunning, and above all, respect for its power. And so does its master. The Leshy is not good or evil. He is a force of nature, as capricious as a wildfire, as nurturing as a spring rain, and as deadly as a winter frost. This made him fundamentally different from the other deities and spirits in the Slavic pantheon. The high gods, like the thunderer Purin, were celestial beings. They dwelled in the sky, their concerns were cosmic, their battles fought on a scale beyond human comprehension. The spirits of the home, like the domovoi, were domestic, intimate presences, concerned with the welfare of a single family, the warmth of a single hearth. But the Leshy was terrestrial. He was immediate. His power was not in the distant heavens or within the walls of the house, but right there, 10 feet from your door, in the dark wall of trees that marked the end of your world and the beginning of his. The gods of the sky might be appeased with grand sacrifices, the spirits of the home with a bowl of milk. But the Leshy required a different kind of currency, a constant, vigilant, and fearful respect for the ground you walked upon. His dominion was absolute, but it was also local. It was understood that not all forests were ruled by a single entity. Rather, each great wilderness had its own Leshy, its own king. The Leshy of the vast pine forests of the north might be a somber, grim, and dangerous figure, while the Leshy of a sunnier birch grove to the south might be more prone to mischief and games. The people of one village would know the specific temperament, the rules and the taboos of their Leshy, passed down through generations. They knew which paths he favored, which ancient trees were sacred to him, and what specific offerings he preferred. This localized belief made the Leshy an even more tangible and intimate presence. He was not an abstract concept. He was a neighbor. A very, very powerful and utterly unpredictable neighbor. The sudden chill you felt in a warm clearing, the whistle that seemed to follow you through the trees, the unnerving feeling of being watched from the shadows, these were not random occurrences. These were the signs of the master of the woods, asserting his presence, reminding you that you were a guest in his kingdom. As centuries passed and new beliefs swept across the land, people tried to fit this ancient primal being into new cosmologies. The arrival of Christianity, in particular, could not simply erase a belief so deeply rooted in the daily lives of the people. So the Leshy was recategorized. To the priests he was a demon, a fiend of the woods. But to the common folk, who still had to live by the forest, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Stories were woven to explain his origin within a Christian framework. One of the most enduring of these tales claims that the Leshy and his kind are fallen angels. During the Great War in heaven, when Lucifer was cast down, a host of angels fell with him. Some were so wicked they were condemned to the depths of hell. But others were not truly evil, merely weak or indecisive. They were not worthy of heaven, but not damned enough for hell. They fell short, tumbling through the void until they landed on the earth. They became the spirits of the wild places, the water, the fields, and the forests. The Leshy, according to this tradition, is one of these lost angels, a being of immense power, forever barred from heaven, ruling a terrestrial kingdom of wood and shadow, his nature a mixture of divine memory and earthly wildness. Another, more tragic and folkloric tale, ties his origin to the first humans. It is said that after being cast from Eden, Adam and Eve had many children. One day, God announced he would visit them to see their offspring. Fearing that God would be displeased by the sheer number of children they had, or perhaps ashamed of some who were unruly or strange, Eve hid several of them away in the forest and in the water. When God arrived, he looked upon the children presented to him and blessed them. He then asked Adam and Eve, "Are these all of your children?" Fearing his wrath, they lied and said, "Yes, Lord, these are all." God, in his omniscience, knew they were lying. He declared, "As you have hidden them from me, so shall they and their descendants remain forever hidden from the sight of men." And so, those hidden children became the spirits of the wild, the Rizalki in the water, and the Leshy in the woods. This story casts the Leshy in a more sorrowful light, not as a demon, but as a lost soul, a part of humanity's original family, yet forever separated, belonging to the wild places he was hidden in. These are the stories people told to make sense of him. But the oldest, deepest, and most resonant truth of the Leshy is that he requires no such origin story. He was not created. He did not fall from heaven or spring from the loins of Adam. The Leshy simply is. He is a fundamental power, an emergent consciousness born from the ancient, living forest itself. He is as much a part of the natural world as the gravity that holds the stones to the earth, and the cycle of seasons that turns the green leaves to gold. He is the soul of the wilderness, and to enter his domain is to come face to face with the awesome, beautiful, and terrifying power of a world that was here long before us, and will be here long after we are gone. Understanding this is the first step. Next, we must look at the being itself, the forms it takes, the powers it wields, and the laws by which it rules its ancient kingdom. We have established the kingdom, the vast, primeval forest, a living entity with a consciousness and a will. Now we must turn our gaze upon the king himself. To ask, what does the Leshy look like, is to ask a question that is at once simple and profoundly complex. It is like asking, what does the wind look like? Or what is the shape of a shadow? The Leshy has no single fixed form, for he is a master of metamorphosis, a being whose very essence is mutable and fluid. His appearance is a reflection of his domain, ever-changing, wild, and designed to interact with the mortal mind in ways that can be deceptive, terrifying, or utterly incomprehensible. To catalog his forms is to catalog the forest itself. He is a walking repository of masks, and each one is chosen with purpose. But through the countless tales told around flickering fires, through the whispered warnings of hunters and the fragmented accounts of those who returned from the woods with their minds forever scarred, a primary image emerges. There is a guise he seems to prefer when he chooses to walk in a shape that is almost but not quite human. When he chooses to confront a man on two legs, the Leshy often takes the form of an ancient, wizened figure. This is not the feeble, bent old man of a human village, but an antiquity carved from the very substance of his kingdom. Imagine skin that is not soft flesh but is as rough and gnarled as the bark of an ancient oak, fissured with lines that are not wrinkles of age, but the very grain of the wood. His skin can sometimes appear mottled with patches of lichen, or carry a strange, unhealthy bluish tinge. The folklore is specific on this. It is said the Leshy's blood is not red, but a deep, vibrant blue, the color of twilight or a poisonous flower, and this unearthly ichor sometimes colors his complexion, marking him as a being outside the natural cycle of human life and death. His hair and beard are not made of human filament. They are the wild growths of the forest floor, long and tangled like hanging moss, often with the greenish cast from the dampness of his domain. Twigs, burrs, and dried leaves are caught in their snarls, as if he has just risen from a slumber of 100 years beneath the forest floor. He is a part of the landscape and the landscape is a part of him. And then there are his eyes. Those who have claimed to see them and retained their sanity speak of eyes that are not human. They do not hold human emotion, not joy, not sorrow, not anger as we understand it. They are 2 points of piercing luminous green, like foxfire glowing in the deepest dark, or like superheated embers from a fire made of magical wood. They hold an ancient, non-human intelligence, the cold, calculating sentience of a predator, and the bottomless depth of a being who has witnessed the turning of millennia. To look into the Leshy's eyes is to feel your own fleeting mortality, to understand that you are being assessed by a power that sees you not as a person, but as a curiosity, a plaything, or an obstacle. This humanoid form, however convincing it may be from a distance, is a performance. And like any performance, if you look closely, you can see the flaws in the costume, the tells that betray the actor. It is these small, unnerving details that often serve as the first warning that you are not speaking to a lost woodsman, but to the master of the woods himself. These are the cracks in the facade of reality through which the true, alien nature of the Leshy shines. The first and most commonly cited detail is his clothing. The Leshy, in his human guise, will almost never wear a belt or a sash. To the modern mind, this seems a trivial detail. But to a Slavic peasant of centuries past, it was a profound sign. A belt was not merely functional. It was a symbol of order, of civilization. It girded a man, gave him form, and was often imbued with protective charms. To be ungirded was to be wild, uncivilized, outside the bounds of human society. The Leshy's lack of a belt is a statement. I am not bound by your rules, by your sense of order. More subtly, there is the matter of his coat or kaftan. He wears it buttoned the wrong way. In traditional Slavic culture, men fasten their coats with the left flap over the right. The Leshy does the opposite, fastening the right flap over the left. This is a classic folkloric signifier of the other world. Spirits, demons, and otherworldly beings are often depicted as doing things in reverse, as a mirror image of the human world. It is an inversion of the natural order, a small but deeply unsettling clue that this being is fundamentally inverted, fundamentally wrong. His face, too, lacks the finishing touches of a human being. He is often described as having no eyebrows and no eyelashes. The absence of these small features creates a blank, mask-like smoothness to his gaze that is deeply unnerving. Some tales go further, stating that he is missing his right ear entirely, a bizarre and specific mutilation that marks him as incomplete, as something other. Perhaps the most definitive sign, known across all Slavic lands, is that the Leshy casts no shadow. In a world governed by the sun, where every object has its dark twin upon the ground, a man who stands in broad daylight and casts no shadow is a being that is not truly of that world. He does not belong to the physical plane in the same way we do. He is a phantom, a spirit given temporary form, and the light of our world passes through him. And finally, there is the most peculiar and famous detail of all: his shoes. The Leshy is often depicted wearing traditional peasant shoes, woven from bast fiber. But he wears them on the wrong feet. The left shoe is on his right foot, and the right shoe is on his left. This seemingly absurd, almost comical detail is perhaps the most profound symbol of his nature. It speaks to his role as a trickster, a being of chaos and confusion. His very footing in the world is backwards, inverted. For the lost traveler, spotting this bizarre mistake could be the key to their salvation, the final undeniable proof that the friendly old man offering to guide them is, in fact, the very architect of their predicament. While his wizened humanoid guise is his most iconic, it is but one tool in his arsenal. The Leshy's true power lies in his ability to become anything within his domain. This shapeshifting is not merely a disguise. It is an extension of his will, a way to interact with and manipulate any who enter his kingdom. He might appear as a familiar figure, a trusted face from your own village. Imagine being lost, desperate, and seeing your own father or brother step out from behind a tree, beckoning you to follow. The relief would be overwhelming. You would follow without question, ignoring the strange silence of the woods around you, ignoring the fact that the path he leads you on seems to be growing darker, wilder. You would follow him into a bog, or off the edge of a ravine, and only in the final moment would his familiar face melt away into the bark-like visage of the Leshy, his laughter echoing as you fall. This is his cruelest deception, turning the human need for connection and trust into a lethal weapon. His command over the animal kingdom is absolute, and so he often takes the form of its most powerful denizens. He may appear as a colossal bear, larger than any mortal beast, his eyes glowing with that same green, intelligent light. Or he might become a great white wolf, a silent, ghostly predator that moves through the trees with supernatural speed. These are not random choices. In becoming the bear, he embodies the forest's brute strength and untamable power. In becoming the wolf, he embodies its cunning, its pack authority, and its relentless nature as a hunter. But his powers of transformation go far beyond the animal kingdom. He can dissolve his form entirely, becoming one with the environment. He can be the gnarled, moss-covered stump you choose to rest on. He can be the cluster of strange, brightly colored mushrooms that seem to spring up overnight. He can become the wind itself, a sudden localized whirlwind of leaves and dust that spins around you, disorienting you and whispering your name. He is everywhere and nowhere, a constant potential presence in every rock, leaf, and shadow. Of all his incredible abilities, perhaps the most wondrous, the most terrifying, and the most symbolic is his power to change his physical size. The Leshy's stature is not fixed. It is directly and mystically linked to the state of the forest around him. Within the heart of his domain, when he walks among the ancient towering pines and firs, the Leshy can draw power from them, growing to match their impossible height. He becomes a giant, a colossus of wood and moss whose head brushes the forest canopy and whose stride covers a quarter-mile. His voice in this form is not a human sound, but the roar of the wind through 1,000 branches, the groan of ancient wood, a sound powerful enough to shake the leaves from the trees and the courage from a man's heart. To witness the Leshy in his giant form is to witness the full, untamed majesty and terror of the primeval forest. It is a sight that could break a mortal mind. Yet, this incredible power is entirely contextual. Should the Leshy step out of his forest and into a cleared field or a meadow, he shrinks. The further he moves from his trees, the smaller he becomes. At the edge of the wood, he might be the size of a normal man. In the middle of an open field, he can shrink to the height of a stalk of wheat, to the size of a flower, and ultimately to be no bigger than a single blade of grass. He becomes utterly invisible, insignificant. This is not a weakness. It is the most profound statement of his nature. His power, his very existence, is intrinsically bound to the wild. In the forest he is a god. In the world of men, the world of open fields and agriculture, he is nothing. He is a perfect metaphor for the untamable spirit of nature itself, all-powerful within its own context, but diminished and lost when its domain is destroyed. Finally, there is the matter of his voice. The Leshy's sounds are as varied and deceptive as his forms. He is the ultimate mimic, the arch-ventriloquist of the wilderness. He can perfectly replicate the call of any bird, the cry of any beast. He can create the sound of a gurgling stream where the ground is bone-dry, or the sound of a woodcutter's axe to give a lost traveler false hope of rescue. His most chilling talent, as we have noted, is the mimicry of human sounds. The desperate cry of a lost child, the sweet song of a maiden, the hearty laugh of a friend can reproduce them all with flawless accuracy, using them as lures to draw the unwary deeper into his clutches. But when the Leshy speaks with his own voice, it is not a sound any human was meant to hear. It is not a single voice but a cacophony. It is the sound of the entire forest speaking at once. It is the shrieking whistle of the wind, the deafening clap of his hands that sounds like shattering trees, the booming laughter that seems to come from every direction at once, and the roar of 1,000 beasts, all combined into a single overwhelming wave of sound. It is a noise that does not just enter the ears, but penetrates the skull, a sonic assault designed to shatter nerves and break the spirit. The anatomy of the Leshy, then, is the anatomy of the wild itself. It is a creature of terrifying beauty and beautiful terror, a being of profound contradictions. He is solid as an oak and immaterial as the wind. He is a single old man and a legion of beasts. He is a towering giant and an invisible speck. His body is a language, and every detail, from his mismatched shoes to his earth-shattering roar, speaks of a power that is ancient, chaotic, and utterly alien to the ordered world of humanity. Understanding this being is to understand that you are not dealing with a mere monster. You are facing the embodied soul of the wilderness, and you must now learn to navigate its laws, lest you become another one of its games. We have dissected the anatomy of this forest king. explored the myriad forms he wears and the terrifying powers he wields. It is an image of chaos, of unpredictable transformation, of a being whose very physical nature is a fluid nightmare. And yet, to see the Leshy as a creature of pure chaos is to fundamentally misunderstand his role. He is not simply a monster lurking in the shadows. He is a monarch. And his vast, verdant kingdom is not a lawless wilderness. It is a realm governed by a complex and ancient code, a primordial compact between the spirit and the soil. The Leshy is not the forest's madness. He is its law. And to enter his domain is to become subject to his unforgiving jurisdiction. Before we can speak of the pacts and punishments, we must first understand the Leshy's primary function, the sacred duty that defines his existence. He is the guardian, the warden, the great shepherd of the wilds. To the creatures who live and die beneath his canopy, he is not a figure of terror, but a powerful, and at times benevolent, protector. He is the unseen hand that guides the natural world, a force that maintains a balance that mortal men can only disrupt. Folktales from across the Slavic world speak of the Leshy herding the animals of the forest as a man herds his sheep. Imagine the sight, a vision from a lost pagan dream. The Leshy in his towering form striding through the moonlit woods, and moving before him, not in fear, but in disciplined obedience, are the beasts of the wood. A pack of wolves, their usual ferocity tempered into the compliance of sheepdogs, loping at his heels. A herd of deer, their flight instinct becalmed by his presence, following his path. Even the great bears, the solitary lords of their own territories, are said to bow to his will, moving to new feeding grounds at his silent command. He guides their migrations, leading them away from areas where human hunters are too numerous or disrespectful. He drives them to shelter before a great storm or a punishing blizzard, protecting his flock from the cruelties of the weather. It is said that he can make any animal invisible to a hunter's eyes, or grant them supernatural speed to escape a trap. He is their king, and his first loyalty is to them, his silent, furred, and feathered subjects. It is humanity, the interloper, the creature of fire and iron, that must learn to navigate his laws with caution and reverence. For the Leshy's law is simple. The forest and all its children are his, and any interaction with them must be on his terms. The laws of the Leshy were not carved into stone tablets or written on scrolls. They were woven into the very fabric of the culture of those who lived by the forest's edge. They were a set of unwritten rules, passed down from grandparent to grandchild, a litany of do's and do-nots that meant the difference between a safe return with the basket full of mushrooms and vanishing forever into the whispering gloom. The first and most fundamental law was that of respect. The forest was not a place for loud, boisterous human behavior. To enter the woods shouting, singing loudly, or most offensively whistling, was seen as a profound act of arrogance. It was to announce your presence as if you were the master, to pollute the sacred silence of the Leshy's hall with your trivial noise. Swearing and cursing were especially taboo, seen as verbal filth that defiled his domain. The proper way to enter the forest was quietly, humbly, with your thoughts collected, as if entering a great cathedral. You were a guest, and you were expected to behave as such. The second law was that of permission. One does not simply take from the Leshy's domain. Every tree, every berry, every animal was his property. To fell a tree for firewood, to gather herbs for medicine, or to hunt a creature for food required a tacit acknowledgement of his sovereignty. This was most often achieved through a simple but powerful ritual, the offering. Before entering the forest for any purpose beyond simple passage, a person would leave a small gift. It did not need to be grand. The most common and potent offering was a piece of bread, the staff of human life sprinkled with salt. In Slavic culture, bread and salt are the ultimate symbols of hospitality and welcome, a gesture of profound respect and peace. To leave this offering on a prominent tree stump or a large, flat rock was to perform a symbolic transaction. It was to say, "I am a guest in your house." I offer you this, the best of my world, and in return, I ask for your permission to take what I need and for your guarantee of safe passage. Other common offerings included blini, small pancakes, a painted Easter egg, or a colorful ribbon tied to a branch. A splash of human artifice left an offering to the spirit of the wild. To take without asking, to harvest without offering, was not gathering. It was theft. And the Leshy did not suffer thieves gladly. For those whose lives were not just touched by the forest but were entirely entwined with the professional hunters and the village shepherds, a simple offering was often not enough. Their livelihoods depended on a constant, successful interaction with the Leshy's kingdom and its subjects. For these individuals, a more formal, more binding, and far more dangerous arrangement was often sought: a pact. These were not casual agreements. They were solemn magical contracts made between a mortal and a god spirit, often sealed on nights of great spiritual power when the veil between worlds was thin, such as the eve of Ivan Kapala Day or on Easter night. Consider the hunter. His life is a gamble, a contest of skill and luck against the cunning of his prey. A pact with the Leshy could shift the odds dramatically in his favor. To secure such a contract, a hunter would venture into the forest on a chosen night, seeking a place of power, a crossroads of two paths, an ancient, sacred tree, or a lonely clearing. There he would perform a ritual. He might offer a piece of bread and salt consecrated with his own blood. Or, in a more potent ritual, he would write out a contract. Lacking paper and ink, he would use a sharp stick to carve his plea onto the smooth surface of a large leaf or a piece of birch bark, sealing the pact by leaving an offering of great personal significance: a lock of his hair, his baptismal cross, or even a promise of his firstborn child. In return for this fealty, this surrender of his will to the forest lord, the Leshy would become his supernatural patron. The spirit would actively herd game towards the hunter's path. Deer would seem to walk calmly into his sights. Boars would stumble into his traps. Squirrels and martens, prized for their pelts, would seem to practically fall from the trees before him. The hunter would become legendarily successful, his family always fed, his wealth growing. But he was now bound by the Leshy's rules. He could not hunt on certain days sacred to the forest spirit. He could not kill female animals with young. And he could never ever boast of his success or reveal the source of his uncanny luck. He was no longer just a hunter. He was an employee of the forest king. The shepherd's pact was just as common and just as perilous. A shepherd's greatest fears were predators, the wolves and bears that could decimate his flock, and the forest itself, which could swallow his wandering cattle whole. A pact with the Leshy offered protection against both. The shepherd would make his offering, promising a yearly tribute, perhaps the finest sheep in his flock, or the first cheese made in the spring. In exchange, the Leshy would become an unseen herdsman. The wolves would give the shepherd's pastures a wide berth, as if held back by an invisible fence. The cattle would never stray too far, always finding their way back to the fold, even from the deepest woods. The shepherd's flock would grow fat and numerous, the envy of all his neighbors. But like the hunter, he was now bound. His tribute had to be paid without fail. He had to honor the Leshy's laws. His success was no longer his own. It was a loan from a powerful and jealous creditor. The Leshy is a just king, but his justice is that of the wilderness. Swift, absolute, and without appeal. While he might reward fealty, he punished any breach of his laws with a terrifying and often escalating severity. The consequences of disrespect were a cornerstone of the folklore. Grim cautionary tales told to frighten children and chasten adults. For the casual transgressor traveler who whistled on the path, the woodcutter who cursed when his axe slipped, the retribution would often begin as mischief. A warning shot across the bow. A vital tool might mysteriously vanish. An axe left leaning against a tree would disappear, only to be found weeks later, half buried in mud and rusted beyond use. A hunter might find his carefully laid trap sprung and empty, the bait gone. A forager's basket, laboriously filled with berries, might be inexplicably overturned, its contents scattered on the forest floor. These were the Leshy's gentle reminders of his authority. They were annoyances, designed to instill a sense of unease and encourage better behavior. To heed these warnings was to escape with a lesson learned. To ignore them was to invite a far darker fate. For the pact breaker, the punishment was personal and devastating. The very boons the Leshy had granted were turned into instruments of torture. Let us imagine our successful hunter, grown arrogant with his easy kills. One day he breaks the pact. He hunts on a forbidden day. Or he kills a mother bear with her cubs. The retribution is immediate. The forest that was once his ally becomes his enemy. The game vanishes. His arrows fly wide of their mark, as if deflected by an unseen force. He begins to hear the laughter of the Leshy echoing from the trees. The pact of prosperity becomes a curse of failure. Or consider the shepherd. Imagine a year when his flock is so numerous, he grows greedy. He decides to withhold his promised tribute, thinking the forest spirit will not notice or care. That night, a storm of unnatural ferocity might descend upon his farm. In the morning, he would find his flock gone. Not slain, simply vanished. He would search for days, driven to the edge of madness by the faint, phantom sound of his lead sheep's bell, always seeming to come from just over the next hill, just beyond the next thicket, but never reachable. The Leshy would not kill the flock. He would simply take back what was his, leaving the shepherd ruined and insane, a tragic monument to his own broken promise. In some tales, the Leshy would return a single animal, its throat torn out and left on the shepherd's doorstep, a clear, brutal message that the contract was terminated. Perhaps the cruelest punishments were reserved for those who stole from him, the poachers who hunted without permission, the woodsmen who took the oldest, most sacred trees. For them, the Leshy's justice was infused with the terrifying creative malice. A poacher might track a magnificent stag for hours, only to have it lead him into a treacherous, impassable swamp. He might find an animal caught in his snare, but be unable to approach it, as if held back by an invisible wall. In one particularly chilling piece of folklore, the Leshy can tie an animal to a tree with an invisible bond. The poacher would see his prize trapped and helpless, but utterly untouchable. He would be forced to watch as the creature slowly starved to death over days, a grim and protracted lesson on the price of theft in the king's domain. The Leshy's law, then, is the law of balance, of respect, and of consequence. He is not a demon who revels in pointless suffering. He is a guardian who protects his realm with a terrible and immutable logic. His punishments are a direct reflection of the crime. He is the spirit of a world where every action has a swift and equal reaction. But what happens when the king's motives are not so clear? What happens when justice is not the goal, but amusement? What happens when the guardian decides to play a game? That is where the true terror of the Leshy lies. And it is to those games that we must now turn. We have walked the orderly paths of the Leshy's law. We have explored the realm of the guardian, the shepherd, the stern but predictable king who dispenses justice according to a code of respect and retribution. In this world there is a grim logic. An offering earns safe passage, a transgression earns punishment. It is a world of consequence. But the soul of the forest has more than one face. The ancient Slavs knew that the Leshy was not just a king who enforced laws. He was also a being of profound and terrifying caprice. We now leave the courtroom of the guardian and step into the playground of a mad god. This is the aspect of the Leshy that is most deeply feared, the role for which he is most infamous across centuries of folklore. For beyond his duties as a warden, the Leshy possesses a chilling, almost childlike desire for amusement. And his preferred playthings are the fragile minds of the mortals who wander into his domain. This is where we explore the heart of our theme. The psychological warfare he wages, the cruel and intricate games the Leshy plays with the very fabric of your sanity. The games of the Leshy are not born of malice in the way a human understands it. He does not seek to torment for the sake of simple evil. Rather, his games are an expression of his alien nature. It is the curiosity of a being who has lived for millennia, for whom a human life is a fleeting spectacle. It is the play of a predator that toys with its food not from hunger, but from instinct and a desire to see it move. These are not games with rules you can learn or strategies you can employ. The only goal of the game is for the Leshy to be entertained, and the price of losing is often your mind or your life. The most common, the most classic, and perhaps the most existentially terrifying of the Leshy's games is that of disorientation. In the folklore, he is known by a chillingly simple title, the guider off course. This is not the simple confusion of taking a wrong turn. It is a fundamental assault on your perception of reality, a malicious rewriting of the world around you. It begins subtly. A hunter or a berry picker enters the woods on a path they have walked 100 times. A path so familiar they could navigate it blindfolded. The sun is shining, the birds are singing. Everything is as it should be. But then a small detail feels wrong. A familiar lightning-scarred oak tree seems to be on the wrong side of the path. They dismiss it as a lapse in memory and walk on. A few minutes later, they pass the same lightning-scarred oak tree again. This is the moment the cold dread begins to seep in. The victim realizes they are walking in circles. Panic begins to set in, but they try to rationalize. They must be tired, confused. They turn around, determined to retrace their steps back to the village. But the path behind them is gone. Where there was a clear track just moments before, there is now an impenetrable wall of thorn bushes. They try to push through, but the thorns tear at their skin and clothes, a physical denial of their retreat. The Leshy is now actively playing. He is the master of the labyrinth, and the walls are the forest itself. He can make a stream appear where none existed, blocking the way forward. He can cause a dense, unnatural fog to roll in, reducing visibility to a few feet and muffling all sound. Familiar landmarks, a uniquely shaped boulder, a small clearing, there vanish completely, or more cruelly, they shift their position, appearing first to the north, then to the west, mocking any attempt to navigate by them. Those who have survived this ordeal speak of a terrifying sensation. The feeling of being in a place that is like their native forest, but is somehow an echo, a twisted duplicate. It is as if the Leshy has enveloped them in an invisible bubble, transporting them to an otherworldly version of the woods where the laws of geography no longer apply. This is why rescue parties often fail to find the Leshy's victims, even when they were close by. A search party could be shouting the lost person's name, and the victim might hear them as if from a great distance, while in reality, they are standing only yards away, hidden behind an invisible veil, a shimmering distortion in the air that separates the Leshy's playground from the real world. The game is not about making you lost in the woods. It is about making you lost in your own perception, severing your connection to the stable, knowable world. As the victim's sense of direction is shattered, as panic gives way to despair, the Leshy begins his second, and far crueler game, the game of the voice. As we have established, the Leshy is a master of mimicry, but he saves his most potent and heartbreaking impressions for his chosen playthings. Imagine you are lost. The sun is setting, the primordial fear of the dark is creeping in, and you are utterly alone. And then you hear it. A sound that cuts through the fear and pierces you to your very soul. It is your mother's voice calling your name, her tone full of worry. "Come home," she cries, her voice seemingly coming from just beyond a dense thicket. Every fiber of your being, every instinct for safety and comfort, screams at you to run towards that sound. It is a lifeline, a promise of salvation in the encroaching darkness. But the folklore, the stories told by the elders, screams a different warning in your mind. It is a trap. This is the exquisite cruelty of the Leshy's game. He does not use a monstrous roar to frighten you. He uses the sound of love. He weaponizes your deepest emotional connections. For a lost child, he will mimic the gentle, reassuring voice of their father. For a young man, he might create the sound of his lover's laughter, a sweet tinkling sound that promises warmth and reunion. He identifies what you most desperately want to hear and he gives it to you, using your own hope as the bait to draw you ever deeper into his labyrinth, further from any chance of escape. The psychological torment of this game is almost perfect. To ignore the voice feels like abandoning hope itself. But to follow it is to knowingly walk into the spirit's snare. This conflict can shatter the strongest mind. The victim is trapped between instinct and knowledge, between heart and head. And all the while, as they stand frozen in indecision, another sound might drift through the trees, the sound of soft, deep laughter. It has no discernible source, coming from everywhere at once. It is the laughter of the game master, watching his piece on the board squirm in an agony of his own design. The Leshy's torment is not always a slow, drawn-out psychological affair. Sometimes it is startlingly direct, and it is in these moments that we see his most alien quality, the combination of immense power with an almost infantile understanding of fragility. His games can escalate with terrifying speed. It often follows a pattern. First comes the subtle trickery, the misplaced hat, the inexplicably missing tool designed to create a sense of unease. Then comes the disorientation, the looping paths of the living labyrinth. This is followed by the phantom voices, the assault on the emotions. And then when the victim is at their breaking point, shivering with cold and fear, the Leshy might decide to end the game with a physical manifestation. He might reveal himself in his towering tree-like form, a terrifying spectacle meant to shock the victim into madness or death by fright. Or, he might engage in what can only be described as a form of physical play. There are numerous chilling tales of the Leshy's penchant for tickling. To the human mind, tickling is a harmless, playful act. To the Leshy, an ancient spirit of immense strength, it is just another game. He might sneak up on a lost traveler who has fallen into an exhausted sleep and begin to tickle them. But being an inhuman entity, he does not understand mortal limits. He does not know when to stop. The victim, caught between waking and sleeping, between laughter and terror, is subjected to a relentless assault until they die from exhaustion or asphyxiation, a rictus grin frozen on their face. This is perhaps the most terrifying insight into the Leshy's mind. It suggests he is not motivated by pure evil, but by a form of amoral, divine boredom. The death of his victim is not the goal. It is merely an accidental, and to him insignificant, outcome of the game. He is like a child playing with an ant, fascinated by its frantic movements, but utterly indifferent when its legs are accidentally torn off. This blend of childish glee and lethal power makes him more unsettling than any simple demon. To be caught in the Leshy's game seems like a hopeless situation. How can a mortal outwit a god who can rewrite reality and weaponize their deepest emotions? And yet, the same folklore that details his terrors also provides a strange and wonderful set of countermeasures. The Leshy's world is one of inverted logic, and to escape it, you must learn to think backwards. You must fight his madness with a dose of your own. The most famous and widely cited method of escape is a piece of desperate, symbolic theater. If you realize you are lost, that the Leshy is playing his game with you, you must stop. Find a log or a stump and sit down. Then you must take off all your clothes, piece by piece. In the middle of the hostile, watching forest, you must make yourself completely vulnerable. Then you begin to dress again, but you put everything on backwards or inside out. Your shirt on back to front, your trousers on backwards. And most crucially, you must address your feet. You take your left shoe and force it onto your right foot. You take your right shoe and squeeze it onto your left. This act is the key. You are mirroring the Leshy's own inverted nature. His coat buttoned the wrong way. His very essence a contradiction of the human norm. According to the lore, this bizarre spectacle has one of two effects. It either confuses the Leshy, whose orderly, albeit alien, mind is baffled by this nonsensical human behavior, breaking his concentration and dissolving his spell, or more commonly it amuses him. The sight of a terrified human performing this absurd, backwards ritual in his sacred woods is so comical to the ancient spirit that he bursts into his booming, echoing laughter. In his amusement he forgets his game, the invisible walls of his labyrinth fall, and the path home suddenly becomes clear. It is an escape earned not through strength or piety, but through a willingness to embrace the absurd. Other methods exist, tapping into different veins of power. One could recite prayers, but it was said to be more effective if you interwove the sacred words with powerful, blasphemous curses. This created a chaotic spiritual energy that the Leshy, a being who is neither purely divine nor demonic, found distasteful and would retreat from. Carrying salt, a universal symbol of purity and preservation, was also recommended. Throwing a pinch into a fire could create a protective circle. But the most desperate gambit, the absolute last resort for a victim who was certain they would not survive the night, was to fight the forest with its antithesis, fire. To set the Leshy's domain ablaze was the ultimate act of defiance. The guardian self of the Leshy would be forced to take precedence over the trickster self. His game would be forgotten as he rushed to contain the destruction of his kingdom, his attention completely diverted, allowing the human who started the blaze to slip away in the confusion. It is a true Pyrrhic victory. You may save your own life, but you do so by attempting to destroy a god's home, an act of desperation with its own dire consequences. These games and the desperate measures used to escape them are the source of the most poignant and tragic stories surrounding the Leshy tales of those who played and lost. We have witnessed the cruel and whimsical games of the Forest King, the psychological labyrinths and phantom voices he deploys for his own alien amusement. We have even explored the bizarre, inverted logic required to counter his moves and escape his clutches. But for every tale of a clever peasant who outwitted the Leshy by putting his shoes on the wrong feet, there are a dozen other stories that do not end in laughter and a clear path home. They end in silence. They end in madness. They end in a grief that echoes through a village for generations. The archives of folklore are, in essence, a ledger of human sorrow, and the pages dedicated to the Leshy are filled with some of its most poignant entries. We now turn from the rules of the game to the fate of the losers. These are the tragedies of the Whispering Woods, the cautionary tales of those who entered the Leshy's domain and were broken by its power, becoming permanent fixtures in the grim tapestry of his legend. The tragedies associated with the Leshy fall into several distinct, recurring patterns. They are not tales of simple monster attacks of claws and fangs. They are more intimate, more psychological, and ultimately more heartbreaking. They speak of loss, of stolen futures, and of minds fractured beyond repair. Perhaps the most visceral and terrifying of the Leshy's transgressions against humanity was his penchant for abducting children. The forest spirit was said to have a particular interest in the very young, seeing in them something to be collected, a curiosity to be brought into his own wild family. This was not a random act. Certain children were believed to be especially vulnerable. The most at risk were unbaptized infants. In the syncretic world of the Slavic peasant, where Christian beliefs overlaid ancient pagan fears, baptism was more than a sacrament. It was a spiritual shield. An unbaptized child was seen as being in a state of limbo, not yet fully claimed by the human world or its God, and therefore fair game for the spirits of the wild. A moment of parental carelessness leaving an infant alone for even a few minutes near an open door facing the forest was all the opportunity the Leshy needed to sweep in and snatch the child away, leaving behind only an unnerving silence. Equally vulnerable were children who had been cursed by their own parents. In a moment of frustration and anger, a weary mother might scream at her unruly child, "Oh, may the Leshy take you!" In the folklore, such curses, spoken with true emotion, were not empty words. They were an invitation, an abdication of parental protection that the ever-listening forest spirit was all too willing to accept. The parent might regret the words instantly, but it would be too late. The child would wander outside and simply vanish, the careless curse having become a binding contract of surrender. What became of these stolen children? The tales vary, but none are happy. Some were taken deep into the woods to the Leshy's home, sometimes described as a simple hut made of woven branches, other times as an elaborate underground dwelling. There they were raised as the Leshy's own offspring. They would grow up wild, losing all memory of their human life. They would learn the language of the animals and the secrets of the forest, but forget the sound of their own mother's voice. They became Leshychika or Leshanka, wild folk, creatures caught forever between the human world and the spirit realm. There is a famous Russian folktale that powerfully illustrates this tragedy. A hunter, lost deep in the woods, stumbles upon a strange hut. Inside he finds an old Leshy lying dead on a bed of moss. Weeping over the body is a beautiful young woman, completely naked, her hair long and wild. She speaks a strange language of clicks and whistles, and does not seem to understand the hunter's words. He realizes she must be a stolen child, raised by the spirit as his daughter or wife. The hunter, taking pity on her, coaxes her to follow him back to his village. He brings her into his home, gives her clothes, and tries to reintroduce her to human society. But the damage is done. She cannot learn to speak properly. She feels suffocated inside the walls of a house and is terrified by the village crowds. She is naked and unashamed, a creature of the forest who cannot comprehend human modesty. She is forever broken, a soul whose identity was stolen along with her body, a living ghost haunted by a wildness she can no longer embrace and a humanity she can no longer understand. In some of the darkest tales, the Leshy did not simply take. He replaced. After stealing a healthy human infant, he would leave one of his own offspring in the cradle. This creature, known as a changeling, would look superficially like the stolen child, but its wrongness would soon become apparent. It was often sickly and pale, with the blue-tinged skin of its father. It possessed an insatiable, monstrous appetite, eating more than a whole family combined, yet remaining thin and weak. It would cry with a voice that was not a baby's wail but an old man's grating scream. The parents would spend years caring for this shrieking, voracious creature, their lives ruined by the emotional and financial drain, all while their true child was lost forever in the woods. The changeling was a living, breathing symbol of their loss, a daily punishment that would drive the entire family to ruin and despair. Young women, particularly those of great beauty, were another target of the Leshy's desire. The forest spirit, often described as having a family of his own, would sometimes seek a mortal bride. A young woman, perhaps wandering too close to the woods at twilight, or one who was betrothed against her will, might be spirited away. Her fate was to become the Leshy's wife, a Leshychika. She would lose her humanity and become a powerful and terrifying forest spirit in her own right. Her beauty would become wild and unsettling, her voice no longer singing human songs, but shrieking on the wind. Travelers would report hearing the terrifying cries of a woman from the depths of the forest, and the elders would nod grimly, knowing it was another lost soul. Another forest bride crying for a life she could no longer remember. She became a part of the forest's terror, a tragic echo of lost humanity. Consider the archetypal tragedy of the wedding party. This story appears in many forms across the Slavic world. A stark warning against hubris and disrespect. A wedding procession, full of celebratory vodka and boisterous song, decides to take a shortcut through the forest to reach the groom's village. They are warned by the village elders, but in their drunken confidence, they laugh off the old tales. They enter the woods at dusk, shouting, singing, and whistling, committing every possible transgression against the forest's sacred silence. As they venture deeper, a sudden unnatural quiet falls. The bird song ceases, The wind dies. Their own drunken voices echo unnervingly in the oppressive silence. Then they hear it. From up ahead, the sound of another wedding party, the tinkling of bells, joyous music and happy laughter. Relieved, thinking they have stumbled upon friends or another celebration, they urge their horses on, following the phantom sounds. The path grows darker and more treacherous. The phantom music leads them away from the true path and into the heart of a vast, stinking marsh. Their wagons sink into the mud, the horses panic and scream, and the joyous music they were following transforms into a cacophony of booming, mocking laughter that surrounds them from all sides. The wedding party, bride and groom included, is swallowed by the swamp, their celebration turned into a mass grave. Their story becomes a legend told every winter, a grim reminder that the Leshy's domain is not a place for human parties, and that his laws apply to all, no matter how joyous the occasion. The tragedies of the Leshy are not always about abduction. Many are slow-burning descents into madness, born from broken promises or simply from a mind ill-equipped to handle the raw, alien nature of the forest soul. We have spoken of the pacts made by hunters and shepherds. The tragic figure of the failed pact-maker is a staple of the folklore. There is the tale of the shepherd who, for years, enjoyed the Leshy's protection. His flock was the envy of the region, but he grew complacent then arrogant. He neglects his yearly tribute. He enters the forest on a forbidden day. He forgets the source of his fortune. The retribution is not a simple attack. It is a masterpiece of psychological torture. His entire flock vanishes overnight. As we have described, he spends the rest of his life wandering the forest's edge, haunted by the phantom sound of their bells, calling their names until his own voice is a raw whisper. He doesn't die. He is left to live a shattered man, a public spectacle of the price of a broken promise, a more potent warning than any quick death could ever be. And then there are the most pitiable victims of all, those who were not disrespectful, who did not break any pacts, but who simply got lost and fell into the Leshy's game. These are the individuals who were not seeking anything but the path home, and instead found themselves the unwilling playthings of a god. These are the ones who were subjected to the full arsenal of his psychological warfare. The looping paths, the shifting landmarks, the phantom voices of loved ones, the unnerving sourceless laughter. Some of these victims were never found, their bones becoming part of the forest floor. But some were. They would be discovered weeks later, miles from where they were last seen, in a state of profound psychic collapse. They would be emaciated, their clothes in tatters, their skin covered in scratches and their hair matted with leaves and moss. But the true damage was to their minds. Their eyes would be vacant, looking at a world they no longer recognized. They would be unable to speak, or would mutter incoherently about trees that walked, of whispers that promised them the world, of a laughing old man with green eyes and shoes on the wrong feet. Their sanity had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by the Leshy's games. They were the living casualties of his amusement. They would live out their days in the village, sitting by the fire, shivering even on the warmest days, forever looking over their shoulders towards the dark line of trees on the horizon. They were a constant tragic reminder to everyone of what the forest could do to you. They were proof that the greatest danger in the Leshy's woods was not being killed, but being allowed to live after you had looked upon the face of its mad king. For uncounted centuries the Leshy reigned. His rule was absolute, his kingdom a vast breathing empire of green. His law was etched into the bark of every tree, and the heart of every person who lived within sight of his domain. He was the guardian who herded the beasts, the trickster who played games with the mind, the stern king who demanded tribute, and the capricious god whose laughter could mean either amusement or doom. The relationship between humanity and this spirit was one of the most fundamental compacts of the ancient world. A coexistence built on a foundation of intricate rituals, whispered stories, and a constant, vigilant, and deeply ingrained fear. He was a pillar of the old world, as permanent and immovable as the forest itself. But no kingdom, no matter how ancient, lasts forever. No god, no matter how powerful, is immune to the changing tides of human belief and the relentless march of human hands. The story of the Leshy in the modern era is not one of climactic battle, but of a slow, creeping erosion. It is a long, quiet tragedy of decline, the fading of a primal power in the face of two forces more relentless than any mythical monster. A new god, and a new world built of iron. The twilight of the Leshy began not with the swing of an axe, but with the tolling of a church bell. The arrival of Orthodox Christianity into the Slavic lands heralded a profound ideological war, a battle for the very soul of the people. This was not a swift conquest. The old gods were deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, into the turning of the seasons and the cycle of the harvest. You could not simply erase a being like the Leshy, whose presence was felt with every rustle of the leaves and every shadow that fell across the path. So he was not erased. He was recast. He was demonized. In the old pagan worldview, the Leshy was a neutral force of nature. His horns were a symbol of virility and his connection to the horned beasts of the wood, like the stag and the wild goat. His occasional cloven hooves linked him to the wild, untamed animal world. He was dangerous, yes, but not inherently evil. He was a deity of his own domain with his own rules. But in the new Christian cosmology, there was no room for neutral nature gods. There was one God in heaven and his adversary, the devil, in hell. Any powerful pre-Christian spirit had to be placed into this new dualistic framework. And so the Leshy, the wild king of the forest, was demoted. He became a devil, a demon, a fiend of the woods. His horns and hooves were no longer symbols of nature. They were now the unmistakable brand of the demonic, the very features of Satan himself. His wildness was no longer a sign of his primordial nature, but of his inherent wickedness. The games he played were not the whims of a capricious god, but the malicious temptations of a soul-stealing fiend. The pacts made with him were not contracts with the nature spirit, but damnable bargains made with a servant of hell. The forest lord became a lieutenant in the armies of darkness. This reframing had a profound effect on the rituals of interaction. The old ways were about coexistence and appeasement. You left bread and salt to show respect, to ask for permission to be a guest in his house. The new ways were about conflict and expulsion. The sign of the cross, once a foreign symbol, was now taught to be a spiritual weapon that could drive the Leshy away. A whispered prayer replaced the offering on the tree stump. The goal was no longer to live alongside the spirit of the woods, but to cleanse the woods of its spirit. The forest was to be tamed not just physically, but spiritually. And yet, this ideological war was only partially successful. For the priests in the towns and the nobles in their halls, the Leshy was a demon. But for the peasant whose cottage still stood at the very edge of the trees, whose cattle still grazed near the dark woods, the old fears and the old respect died hard. This gave rise to a fascinating period of dual faith, or dvoevry, where Christian and pagan beliefs existed in an uneasy truce. A villager might attend church on Sunday and pray to the Christian God for salvation, but on Monday, when heading into the forest to gather wood, he would still quietly leave an offering of bread, just in case. He would wear a cross around his neck, but he would also know the secret words and rituals to ward off the Leshy's mischief. It was a form of spiritual insurance, acknowledging the new power without fully abandoning the old. The Leshy was diminished, but he was not gone. He still lurked in the deep woods and in the deeper parts of the human mind. The faith of the cross could weaken him, but it could not kill him. The true death blow, the force that would succeed where theology had failed, was far more mundane and far more absolute. It was the axe, and the saw, and the relentless human hunger for land. The Leshy's power, his very stature and consciousness, was intrinsically and mystically tied to his domain. He was as tall as the tallest trees. His strength was the strength of the ancient forest. His kingdom was not a metaphysical realm. It was a physical place. And that place was shrinking. The Industrial Revolution and the centuries of expansion that followed it were a more effective exorcism than any prayer. A new god had arrived in the Slavic lands, a god not of faith but of progress. Its sermons were the shriek of the sawmill and the roar of the factory. Its rituals were the felling of trees and the clearing of land. And its creed was that nature was not a spirit to be respected, but a resource to be consumed. For every acre of ancient forest that was felled to make way for farmland, the Leshy's kingdom shrank. For every road cut through the wilderness, his labyrinth was scarred and broken. For every railway line that sliced through a sacred grove, his power was severed. We must recall his most profound magical ability, his power to change his size. He was a giant among the trees, but in an open field, he shrank to the size of a blade of grass. As the great forests of Europe were systematically dismantled, the Leshy was quite literally being diminished. The god who once stood as tall as a pine was being reduced, acre by acre, to the status of a weed. Imagine the spiritual devastation from the Leshy's perspective. Each swing of the axe was a blow against his own body. The sound of a falling oak, a tree that had stood for 500 years, must have been his own death scream. The clearings that grew larger and larger were like gaping wounds in his flesh, spaces where his power evaporated under the open sun. His subjects, the beasts of the wood, lost their homes, their populations dwindling, their protector now unable to protect them from this new unstoppable force. His entire world, the source of all his magic and his very identity, was being unwritten. The great Russian writer Vladimir Nabokov, a man deeply attuned to the ghosts of his homeland, captured this tragedy perfectly in a short story. He wrote of a Russian Leshy who, after his native forest is cut down, is forced to emigrate. This ancient, powerful being is reduced to a pathetic, displaced figure, trying to find a new home in the managed parks and sparse woodlands of Western Europe. But the magic is gone. The trees are too young, the woods too small. He is a god without a temple, a king without a kingdom. He wastes away, his powers failing, and eventually, he sickens and dies, a sorrowful, diminished figure fading into nothingness in a foreign land. It is one of the most poignant literary epitaphs for the old gods, a perfect metaphor for how the death of a wilderness means the death of its soul. The laughter of the Leshy that once terrified travelers was drowned out by the whistle of the steam train. The paths he twisted into maddening loops were straightened, paved, and named. The dark, mysterious woods that fueled the imagination and inspired such fearful reverence were replaced by neat, predictable rows of crops. The wild god was being defeated not by a hero or a saint, but by something far more prosaic: zoning laws and economic development. So, is the Leshy dead? Perhaps. The vast primeval forest that was his body and soul is gone. The society that believed in him, that feared and respected him, has vanished. But a being that has held sway over the human imagination for so long does not simply disappear. He leaves echoes. He becomes a ghost. Today the Leshy lives on, but he has been transformed once more. He has been relegated from the realm of faith to the realm of folklore, and from folklore to the realm of popular entertainment. His most prominent modern home is in video games, most famously in the world of The Witcher. Here he appears as a formidable opponent, a powerful monster of the woods, a relict from a bygone age. He is often magnificently designed, a terrifying creature of wood and bone, a worthy challenge for any player. And yet, this modern incarnation is both a tribute and a profound misunderstanding. In these games, the Leshy is presented as a boss to be defeated, a monster to be slain. The objective is to kill him, to loot his remains, and to collect the reward. This turns the entire ancient relationship on its head. The old Slavs knew you did not defeat the Leshy. The very idea would have been absurd, like trying to defeat a thunderstorm. The goal was to survive him, to appease him, to respect him. To understand that you were the intruder in his world. By turning him into a monster to be killed, we strip away his most essential qualities. His role as a guardian, his status as a king, his embodiment of the untamed, immoral power of nature. We reduce a complex deity, whose stories taught profound lessons about humanity's place in the natural order, into a simple antagonist. He has become another beast to be hunted, his tragic, fading majesty replaced by a health bar and a list of attack patterns. The fading of the old gods is, in the end, a story about humanity's changing relationship with the world. The Leshy represented a time when we knew we were not the masters, when the wilderness was a vast and terrifying power that demanded our respect. His decline charts our rise to dominance, our growing belief that the natural world is something to be conquered, tamed, and consumed. The fear of the Leshy has been replaced by the profits of logging and the convenience of the highway. But perhaps in losing our fear of him we have lost something more. We have lost our awe. We have journeyed far. We have walked the primeval paths of a lost world. A world dominated by the great green ocean of the forest. We have attempted to understand the soul of that wilderness and the spirit it birthed. We have dissected the anatomy of its inhuman king, a being of bark and shadow, of shifting form and glowing green eyes. We have studied his ancient laws, the pacts he made and the terrible justice he dispensed. We have played his maddening games, navigating the labyrinths of the mind and fleeing from the phantom voices of our own hopes. We have stood witness to the tragedies left in his wake, the stolen children, the forest brides, the shattered minds. And finally, we have watched the slow, inexorable twilight of his reign, as his kingdom was felled by the axe and his name was demoted from god to demon to, finally, a half-forgotten fable. After this long and shadowed journey, it would be easy to close the book and label the Leshy, to file him away in the bestiary of the mind under Slavic forest demon, or malevolent trickster spirit. It would be easy to see him as a simple monster, a villain from the grim fairy tales of a superstitious age. But to do so, to reduce him to a mere antagonist, is to miss the profound and terrifying truth he represents. The Leshy is not the story. He is the vessel that holds the story. He is a mirror, reflecting humanity's most ancient and complex relationship, our bond of dependence, terror, and awe with the natural world itself. The Leshy is more than a monster. He is a personification, a living metaphor for a world that humanity no longer truly knows. To understand him is to understand that the wilderness that birthed him was not a passive landscape. It was an active, conscious participant in human life, and its nature was one of profound duality. The Leshy is both a nurturing shepherd and a cruel trickster for one simple reason. The forest itself is both of those things. Consider the forest as the early Slavs knew it. It was the great provider. Its trees gave them shelter from the killing cold, and wood for the fires that were the very heart of their civilization. Its creatures gave them meat for their tables and furs for their backs. Its floor gave them herbs that could heal their sick and berries that could feed their children. The forest was a generous, life-giving parent. This is the Leshy in his role as the guardian, the shepherd of beasts who, if shown the proper respect, might guide a prize stag to a hunter's arrow or keep the wolves from a shepherd's flock. This is the logic of the offering, the pact, the symbiotic relationship. It is the recognition that the forest gives, and a gift requires gratitude. But that very same forest was a relentless killer. The same shadows that offered respite from the summer sun could conceal a hungry bear or a pack of wolves. The same mushrooms that could provide a feast could also hold a poison that would kill a family in screaming agony. The same vastness that held such bounty could also swallow you whole, turning you around in maddening circles until you collapse from exhaustion and fear, your bones destined to become part of the soil. The forest was a terrifying, indifferent predator. This is the Leshy in his role as the trickster, the guider off course, the player of games with sanity. His cruelty is the cruelty of the wild. Impersonal, absolute, and without malice. A blizzard does not hate you when it freezes you. A swamp does not hate you when it drowns you. They are simply acting according to their nature. The Leshy in his games is the same. His laughter is the rustle of leaves that care not whether you live or die. He is the embodiment of a worldview that has been almost entirely lost to us. In our modern post-industrial age, we view nature as a resource. It is a collection of commodities: board feet of lumber, barrels of oil, tons of ore. It is a backdrop for our recreation, a place to hike or camp before returning to the real world. We see it as something passive, something for us to act upon. The Leshy represents a world where that relationship was inverted. Nature was the power. It was the active force, and humanity was the fragile reactive element. It was a conscious entity, and you did not act upon it without consequence. This is the key to understanding his tragedies. The stories of stolen children and ruined shepherds are not simple tales of demonic evil. They are morality plays about the consequences of disrespect, arrogance, and forgetting your place in the natural order. A child cursed by its parent is a story about the sanctity of the family bond, and the danger of inviting darkness into your own home. A wedding party swallowed by a swamp is a story about the sin of hubris, of drunkenly assuming that human celebration takes precedence over the sacred silence of the wild. A pact maker driven to madness is a story about the immutable law of reciprocity. The Leshy's justice is the justice of an ecosystem. When one part takes too much, or breaks the rules, the entire system pushes back with devastating force. And what of his games? His assault on the human mind? This is perhaps his most relevant and enduring aspect. The Leshy's games are a powerful metaphor for the fragility of human reason, when confronted by the vast, ancient, and truly alien consciousness of the non-human world. We build our sanity on a foundation of patterns, logic, and predictable causality. The sun rises in the east, paths lead from one point to another. Familiar voices belong to familiar people. The Leshy's game is to demonstrate that all of these rules are merely a thin, fragile veneer laid over a reality that is far older and stranger. He systematically dismantles these certainties. He makes paths loop, he moves landmarks, he puts the voices of loved ones into the mouth of a monster. He shows us that our sanity is a construct, and in his domain, he can deconstruct it for his own amusement. To be lost in the Leshy's woods is to be lost in a place where the human mind's operating system has crashed, undone by a force that it was never designed to compute. Today the great forests are mostly gone. The world that believed in the Leshy, the world that needed a name and a face for the power that lurked in the trees, has faded into history. As we saw, his kingdom was clear-cut, his power shrinking with every fallen tree. He has become a ghost, a whisper. His most visible legacy is in fiction and games, where he lives on as a magnificent but simplified shadow of his former self. We have turned the god of a living world into a monster on a screen, and in doing so, we demonstrate how completely our perspective has changed. The goal is no longer to survive the forest. The goal is to conquer it, to defeat its guardian, and to claim its loot as our own. The story of the Leshy has become the story of our own victory over the wild. But is that the end of the story? Perhaps not. Because the feeling the Leshy represents has not vanished entirely. It has been buried but not destroyed. It is a primal memory that still stirs within us. And perhaps even now, when you find yourself walking in one of the world's last remaining wild places, a deep national park, an ancient mountain trail, and the light begins to fail. When the path ahead looks unerringly similar to the path behind. When a sudden profound silence falls over the woods, and the air grows inexplicably cold. When you get that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, that unshakable primordial feeling that you are being watched by unseen intelligent eyes. In that moment, when your modern rational mind scrambles for an explanation, it might be wise to pause, to listen to the whispers on the wind, to show a moment of quiet respect, and to remember the old man of the forest. Because even if his kingdom has been reduced to a few scattered remnants, The ancient truth of his legend remains. In his realm you are still the guest and he is still the king. Part 2. The Tuatha De Danann explained. The gods who were driven underground. There are places in this world where the veil is thin, places where the land itself seems to hum with a forgotten power, where the rolling green hills feel less like earth and more like the slumbering bodies of sleeping giants. This is Ireland, an island drenched in mist and memory, a landscape that is itself a library of ancient lore. To walk its fields is to walk through the pages of a story written in standing stones and burial mounds, a story that whispers of a time when this world was not as it is now. Before the age of men as we know it, before history began to be written in sober, factual ink, this Emerald Island was the stage for a drama of gods and monsters, of sublime magic and profound tragedy. It was a prize fought over by primal earth dwellers and monstrous sea demons. But for one glorious fleeting age, it belonged to a race of beings unlike any who had come before or who have come since. They were masters of art and science, poets and warriors, smiths and sorcerers. They arrived on the wind, cloaked in cloud, wielding artifacts of impossible power. They were beings of light and skill who ruled a kingdom of unparalleled splendor. They were the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. And yet, if you search for them now, you will not find them. Their shining cities have vanished. Their great halls are silent. Their age is over. But they did not die. They were not, in the end, conquered by a greater army or a more terrible monster. They were defeated by something far more subtle and far more powerful. The coming of a new reality. They were driven underground. Welcome to the Eldritch Codex. Today we journey back to the heart of the mythic age to tell the story of Ireland's last and greatest pantheon of gods. We will witness their glorious arrival, their epic wars for the soul of the island, their golden age of artistry and light, and the final poetic tragedy that saw them fade from our world into the shadows of the next. This is the story of the Tuatha De Danann, the gods who were driven underground. Our story, like that of the Tuatha De Danann themselves, does not begin on the shores of Ireland. It begins in a place far from the world of men, a place that exists only in the deepest strata of myth. The ancient texts, the Liber Gabla Irenth Book of the Takings of Ireland, tell us that this shining race came from 4 legendary cities, hidden away in the mysterious northern islands of the world. These were not cities as we would understand them, sprawling constructs of stone and commerce. They were something more. They were divine universities, grand academies dedicated to the pursuit and perfection of all the higher arts of existence. These 4 cities were named Phaleas, Gorias, Murias, and Phineas. Imagine Phaleas, the city of light, where the very stones were said to glow with the soft, internal luminescence. Here, under the tutelage of the great sage Morfessa, the Tuatha De learned the secrets of sovereignty and wisdom. They learned that kingship was not a matter of brute force, but a sacred contract between a ruler and the land itself, a mystical sympathy that bound the health of the kingdom to the integrity of its king. Imagine Gorias, the city of fire and steel, its heart a great ever-burning forge. Here the sage Esras taught them the arts of war and championship. They learned not the brutal savagery of the berserker, but the sublime lethal geometry of combat, the perfect dance of spear and shield, the unerring flight of the javelin. They learned that true martial prowess was an art form, as demanding and as beautiful as poetry. Imagine Murias, the city of water and life, where great fountains played melodies and the gardens were always in bloom. Under the wise sage Euitius, they mastered the arts of healing, hospitality, and abundance. They learned that a society's true wealth was measured not in the gold it hoarded, an idea that was alien to them, but in the generosity it showed, in the constant flow of life-giving sustenance from the hands of its leaders to the mouths of its people. And imagine Phineas, the city of the sky, built on a mountain peak that pierced the clouds. Here the sage Semias taught them the deepest secrets of all. The arts of magic, of poetry, of prophecy. They learned the hidden names of things, the rhythms of the cosmos, and the power of the spoken word to shape reality itself. In these 4 cities, the Tuatha De Danann were forged. They became beings in whom every noble art was perfected. They were not just warriors, they were warrior poets. They were not just magicians, they were magiciansmiths. Skill, in every conceivable form, was the very essence of their divinity. But their time of learning was finite. A deep ancestral memory, a pull in their very blood, called them to their true home. The island they knew was their destiny. The Isle of Innisfail, Ireland. And when they finally departed from their luminous northern cities, they did not leave empty-handed. They understood that to rule they needed more than just skill, they needed symbols. They needed to bring with them the very heart of the knowledge they had gained. From each city they brought a single magnificent treasure, an artifact of such profound power that it would become a pillar of their legend and a cornerstone of their kingdom. From the radiant city of Phaelius, they brought the Lia Fail, the stone of destiny. This was not a throne of gold or jewels, but something far more potent. A great rough-hewn standing stone, alive with the primal magic. This was the ultimate kingmaker, the arbiter of all legitimate rule. The lore is clear and absolute. When the one true High King of Ireland, the man destined by fate and character to rule, placed his feet upon its surface, the stone of destiny would cry out. It would not be a mere crack or groan, but a deafening joyous roar, a sound like the land itself shouting its approval, a sonic coronation that would echo from one end of the Emerald Isle to the other. To be acclaimed by the Lia Fail was to be undeniably, divinely endorsed. It was the physical manifestation of the sacred bond between ruler and realm. From the forged city of Gorias, they brought with them the weapon of unstoppable force, the Spear of Luff, sometimes called the Spear of Victory. This was no simple shaft of wood and metal. The spear was a living entity, possessed of a ferocious and insatiable thirst for conflict. So potent was its battle lust that it could not be left uncovered. Its head had to be kept submerged in a great cauldron filled with a sleeping draught of crushed poppy seeds, to soothe its violent spirit and keep it from waking. If left to its own devices, it would strain against its bonds, humming with a terrible energy, capable of igniting and fighting all by itself. But when taken up by a champion, it guaranteed victory. No army could stand against the warrior who wielded the Spear of Luff. No shield could deflect its path. It was invincibility honed to a single lethal point. From Murias, the city of plenty, they carried the treasure of life itself, the cauldron of the Dagda. This was the symbol of divine generosity, the very antithesis of want and famine. It was known as Quarren Dagda, or the Undri, for a simple miraculous reason. No matter how many people were fed from it, it would never be empty. An entire host could feast from its depths, and it would remain full, ever ready to satisfy the hunger of the next guest. It was the physical embodiment of the sacred duty of a leader to provide for his people. In a world where starvation was a constant threat, the cauldron was a promise of eternal life and abundance, a treasure that sustained not only the body, but the spirit of the community. And from Phineas, the city of the Sky Sages, they brought the instrument of inescapable victory, the Sword of Tuatha, also called the Sword of Light. Like the spear, this was no ordinary weapon. It was forged in magic and tempered with prophecies of victory. When it was drawn from its scabbard, it blazed with a light as bright and as cold as the stars. And once it was drawn, its verdict was final. No foe, no matter how swift, could dodge its strike. No armor, no matter how strong, could turn its edge. And no man or god who was wounded by its blade could ever be healed from the injury. It was the weapon of absolute judgment, a symbol that the martial power of the Tuatha De was not just superior, but definitive. Armed with these 4 pillars of their identity, the Stone of Sovereignty, the Spear of Invincibility, the Cauldron of Abundance, and the Sword of Finality, the Tuatha De Danann were ready. They were no longer students. They were masters, and they turned their faces toward their ancestral home. Their journey and arrival were not the mundane sea voyage of mortal men. They did not battle storms or struggle with oars. They came as a supernatural event, a meteorological phenomenon. The chronicles tell us they traveled in dark clouds, carried upon the currents of the upper air. They were a storm of their own making, a divine host descending from the heavens. They landed on the slopes of Sliab and Iarain, the Iron Mountain, in the northern part of Ireland, but their arrival was cloaked in secrecy. For 3 days and 3 nights they maintained the magical mist, a thick impenetrable fog that shrouded the landscape in an unnatural twilight. The sun was blotted out. The people who already inhabited the land, the Firbolg, looked up at the sky and saw only a terrifying sunless darkness, feeling a deep sense of dread, knowing that some great power was at work, but unable to see what it was. Beneath the cloak of this magical darkness, the Tuatha De Danann performed their first and most critical act upon the soil of Ireland. It was a ritual of fire and faith, an irrevocable vow to their new home. They turned to the beautiful sky-riding ships that had borne them from the northern cities, and they set them ablaze. This was an act of breathtaking final commitment. The flames roared into the magical mist, and the thick black smoke from their burning fleet mingled with the enchanted clouds, creating a portent of terrifying power. This was not the act of conquerors who might be driven back. It was not the act of explorers who kept an escape route open. It was a declaration, written in fire against the dark sky, for the land and for themselves to witness. It was a statement that there would be no going back. They had severed their ties to their past. They would either forge their future in this new land, or their ashes would mingle with the ashes of their ships upon its shores. This was their home now, win or die. Then, after 3 days, as the last of their ships smoldered into embers, the Tuatha De Danann let the magical mist dissolve. The sun broke through. The inhabitants of the island, the sturdy Firbolg, looked to the northern mountains, and their hearts were seized with awe and terror. Where before there was only empty hillside, there now stood a great host. They were a people of terrifying beauty and grace, tall and noble-featured, their eyes shining with an otherworldly intelligence. They were clad in armor that seemed to drink the sunlight, and they carried weapons that hummed with a visible power. They stood silent and resolute amidst the smoking ruin of their fleet, having appeared on the land as if they had been born from the fire and the cloud. The age of the Firbolg was over. The age of myth had just begun. The people of the goddess Danann had come home. But Ireland was not yet theirs. It would have to be one. The smoke from the burning ships had cleared, but a new, more potent shadow now lay across the island of Ireland. The Tuatha De Danann had made their dramatic, undeniable appearance, a shining host whose very presence was a challenge to the established order. But Ireland was not an empty land awaiting a new master. For a long time, it had been ruled by a people known as the Firbolg. These were not monstrous beings or crude savages. The Firbolg were a race of men, said to be descended from an earlier wave of settlers who had once been enslaved in the East and had carried bags of earth upon their backs, hence their name, the Men of Bags. They had since thrown off that legacy and become the lords of the island. They were a people of the earth, stout, strong, and dark-featured. They were skilled farmers who knew the land's every secret, and they were formidable warriors, possessed of a fierce, direct courage. Their king was Eachad mac Airc, a just and powerful ruler who had brought law and prosperity to the island. His reign was a golden age for his people. When news reached King Eachad at his royal seat of Tara of the strange, sunless darkness in the north, and of the impossibly beautiful, shining host that was revealed when it cleared, a deep foreboding settled upon him and his court. This was not a common raiding party. This was something new, something that threatened the very foundations of his world. He knew he could not ignore this challenge. He needed to know who these newcomers were, what they wanted, and what power they wielded. To this end he summoned his greatest and most trusted champion, a warrior of immense strength and unshakable courage named Sreng. Eochaid tasked Sreng with the mission of reconnaissance and parley. He was to travel north, approach the encampment of the mysterious invaders, and discover their intentions. Sreng, a man who feared nothing, set out at once. As he approached the Tuatha De Danann encampment, he saw a warrior from their host advancing to meet him. This was Bress, a handsome and eloquent champion of the Tuatha De, chosen for his diplomatic skill. The two figures, one from each race, met in the middle of a green field, a space between two worlds. The moment was a study in contrasts, a physical embodiment of the differences between their peoples. Sreng of the Firbolg was a tower of muscle and sinew, broad-shouldered and dark of hair, his expression stern and resolute. He carried two thick-shafted, heavy javelins, and on his back was a massive shield of hardened leather, as solid and dependable as the earth he ruled. He was the embodiment of physical strength and resilience. Bress of the Tuatha De Danann was his opposite. He was tall and slender, his movements filled with a fluid grace. His face was noble and fair, his eyes bright with an unnerving intelligence. His weapons were not instruments of brute force, but of deadly elegance. Light, slender javelins honed to a razor's sharpness, and a small burnished shield that seemed to dance in the light. He was the embodiment of sublime skill and arcane artistry. The two champions stood for a moment, observing each other with a warrior's respect. They were enemies, but they recognized in one another a formidable quality. Sreng was the first to speak, his voice deep and direct. He asked who they were and from whence they had come. Bress, in a voice as smooth and captivating as a bard's song, replied that they were the Tuatha De Danann, a people of skill and magic, and that they had come to reclaim their ancestral home. Then Bress made the first formal offer. He explained that the Tuatha De did not desire war with the Firbolg, whom they acknowledged as a noble people. They proposed a simple, and in their minds generous division of the land. The island of Ireland would be cut in half. The Tuatha De would take the northern portion, from the great mountain of Ben Ater northwards, and the Firbolg could continue to rule the southern half in peace. It was a gesture of respect, an attempt to avoid bloodshed between two worthy peoples. Sreng listened carefully. The two champions, as a sign of trust and to better understand each other's martial traditions, exchanged spears. Sreng noted the lightness and lethal sharpness of the Tuatha De weapon. Bress noted the immense weight and crushing power of the Firbolg spear. The difference was clear. One was made for precise, skillful killing, the other for overwhelming, furious force. With this new knowledge and the formal offer of the Tuatha De, Sreng returned to Tara to report to his king. He stood before King Eochaid and the assembled chieftains of the Firbolg and told them everything he had seen and heard. He described the otherworldly beauty and confidence of the newcomers, the lethal elegance of their weapons, and the offer they had made. The chieftains of the Firbolg fell into a great debate. Some were afraid. They had heard the awe in Sreng's voice and felt that a war with such a people could only end in ruin. Perhaps it was wiser to accept the offer. But the majority were filled with a fierce, possessive pride. They had ruled this land for generations. It was their home, won by their ancestors' sweat and blood. To simply surrender half of it to these mysterious invaders, no matter how beautiful or powerful, was unthinkable. It was Sreng himself who perhaps swayed the final decision. He acknowledged the Tuatha De's power, but his warriors' pride burned. He believed that the strength and fury of the Firbolg could still win the day. The consensus grew, fueled by a fatalistic pride. One chieftain spoke the words that sealed their fate. "If we give them half," he argued, "they will soon grow discontent and desire it all. It is better to fight now for the whole kingdom than to be slowly pushed from it later." And so, King Eochaid mac Éirc gave his answer. The offer was refused. The land would not be divided. The Firbolg would fight. The die was cast. War was now inevitable. King Eochaid gathered the full might of the Firbolg, a great and furious host, and marched them to the plain of Mag Tuatha plain of Towers, a wide, open expanse in the west of Ireland, in what is now County Mayo. The Tuatha De Danann, led by their magnificent king Tuatha, met them there. For a time there was a pause. Both sides agreed to a truce for 105 days, a period they used to prepare themselves, to sharpen their weapons and to craft their armor. It was a time of tense, grim preparation. When the truce ended, the battle was joined, and it was a conflict of cataclysmic scale, a clash not just of armies but of worldviews. The Firbolg fought with the wild, unrestrained fury. They charged in great howling waves, their heavy spears and axes seeking to crush the Tuatha De through sheer momentum and brute force. The Tuatha De did not meet them head-on. They fought with a sublime, terrifying precision. They moved like dancers, their lines parting to allow a charge to pass through, only to close in from the sides, their light, sharp spears finding every gap in the Firbolg armor. Their sorcerers chanted, raising mists to confuse the enemy and calling down magical fires upon their ranks. For 4 days, the battle raged across the plain. The losses on both sides were immense. The champions of the Firbolg were mighty, slaying many of the Tuatha De warriors. But the magical skill and superior weaponry of the newcomers began to take their toll. The sword of Tuatha was a blur of inescapable light, and where it fell, the Firbolg fell with it. The great treasures were unleashed, and against them mere courage was not enough. The climax of the war came through 2 pivotal and tragic confrontations. King Eochaid of the Firbolg, seeing his army beginning to falter, threw himself into the fray with the desperate courage of a cornered lion. He was a whirlwind of destruction, but he was targeted by 3 of the Tuatha De's greatest champions. They harried him across the battlefield, giving him no rest. Under the heat of the sun and the strain of the endless fighting, a powerful magical thirst was laid upon him by their sorcerers. His throat became a desert of dust. Desperate, he broke from the battle, seeking water to quench the fire that was consuming him. He fled towards the coast, but the 3 Tuatha De champions pursued him relentlessly, finally cornering him on the strand of the sea. There, with no hope of escape and no water to save him, the last great king of the Firbolg was slain. The death of their king should have broken the Firbolg spirit completely, but it did not. For their greatest champion Sreng was still on his feet, and his heart was filled with the grief-stricken rage. He rallied the 300 remaining warriors of the Firbolg and carved a path of destruction through the Tuatha De ranks, seeking a final worthy confrontation. He cut his way through until he stood face to face with the shining king of the invaders himself, Tuatha of the Tuatha De Danann. This was the duel that would decide the soul of the battle, the warrior of earth against the king of the sky. Tuatha, wielding the blazing sword of light, was grace and precision personified. Sreng, wielding his massive battle-axe, was all fury and power. They met in a clash that sent sparks flying into the air. Tuatha was the superior swordsman, his blade darting in, seeking an opening. But Sreng was relentless, his great axe swinging in unstoppable arcs, forcing the Tuatha De king to remain on the defensive. Then, seeing an opening, Sreng put all of his remaining strength, all of his grief for his slain king, and all of his love for his doomed people into one final cataclysmic blow. He swung his great axe. Tuatha raised his shield to block, but the force of the blow was immense. The axe shattered the magical shield and sheared through Tuatha's body, severing his right arm completely at the shoulder. The sword of light clattered to the ground. A cry of horror and disbelief went up from the Tuatha De host. Their king, the vessel of their sovereignty, had been maimed. At that moment the battle effectively ended. The Tuatha De Danann had won the field. The Firbolg were defeated, their king dead, their army shattered. But in the final moment of the battle, Sreng had inflicted a wound on the Tuatha De that was far deeper than any loss of warriors. He had broken their king. In the aftermath, a strange and noble peace was made. The Tuatha De, even in their victory, showed respect for the immense courage of their defeated foes. They offered Sreng and the remaining Firbolg a choice of any of the provinces of Ireland to be their own. Sreng chose the province of Connacht in the west. The offer was honored, and the remnants of the Firbolg settled there, where they would remain a distinct people for centuries. But for the triumphant Tuatha De Danann, the victory was hollow, tainted by a crisis that struck at the very heart of their identity. They were the masters of Ireland. They had proven their right to rule through force of arms. But they had no one to lead them. Their sacred foundational law was absolute. A king had to be physically perfect, whole and unblemished. An imperfect king could not preside over a perfect kingdom. It was a reflection of the mystical bond between the ruler and the land. A maimed king would lead to a maimed and blighted land. Tuatha, the great king who had led them from the northern cities, the wielder of the Sword of Light, was now Tuatha of the missing arm. He was no longer whole. And because he was not whole, he could not be king. The Stone of Destiny, the Lia Fail, would remain silent for him. The throne of Tara was empty. A great victory had been won, but the price of that victory was a wound to their sovereignty, a vacuum of power that left the new lords of Ireland leaderless and vulnerable, just as a new darker threat began to gather its strength in the cold depths of the sea. The dust of battle had settled on the plain of Mag Twyrd. The cries of the fallen had faded into the silence of the burial mounds. The Tuatha De Danann were the undisputed masters of Ireland, their claim sealed in the blood of their warriors and the defeat of the noble Firbolg. They had won the land, but in the quiet halls of their new kingdom, a profound and destabilizing crisis was unfolding. The throne of Tara sat empty. Their king Tuatha, the victor of the war, was now unfit to rule. The savage blow from Sreng's axe had cost him his arm, and in doing so, had cost him his crown. The law of the Tuatha De was inviolable. Their king had to be physically perfect, an unblemished vessel to channel the prosperity of the land. A maimed king meant a maimed kingdom. Tuatha, their proven leader and greatest strategist, was now sidelined by this sacred flaw, a living symbol of the terrible price they had paid for their new home. The people of the goddess Danu, masters of magic, art and war, found themselves in a political quandary. They needed a king, and they needed one quickly. The world was still a dangerous place. For though the Firbolg were pacified, a far older and more malevolent power still lurked just beyond the shores of their new kingdom. These were the Fomorians. If the Tuatha De were beings of light, skill and order, the Fomorians were their dark antithesis. They were a race of sea-dwelling semi-divine beings who represented the raw, untamed, and often monstrous chaos of nature. They were the tempest that sinks ships, the blight that ruins crops, the formless terror that rises from the depths. They were often depicted as grotesque and deformed giants, some with the heads of goats, others with a single eye, a single arm and a single leg, hopping with a terrifying speed. They were an ancient power, and they had long considered Ireland their own personal fiefdom, from which they would periodically emerge to exact crushing tribute from its inhabitants. The Tuatha De now faced a delicate situation. A war with the Fomorians seemed inevitable, but perhaps, they thought, it could be averted through diplomacy. A plan was hatched, a political strategy designed to weave the two opposing powers together through a bond of kinship. The Tuatha De would choose a new king, one who could bridge the gap between the land and the sea, between order and chaos. They would choose a king with Fomorian blood. Brest the Beautiful took the throne. The Lia Fail, the Stone of Destiny, remained silent, the first and most powerful omen that this was a wrongful king, but in their desperation for a solution, the Tuatha De ignored it. And so began a dark and shameful chapter in their history, a reign that was the absolute inversion of everything they held sacred. The soul of Tuatha De Danann society was built on a foundation of divine generosity. A king's worth was measured by his open-handedness. His feasting hall was the heart of the kingdom, a place that must always be filled with light, warmth, music, and the smell of roasting meat and fine ale. It was a king's sacred duty to distribute wealth, to reward his warriors for their courage, to honor his poets for their songs, and to patronize his artisans for their crafts. A king's generosity was the magical engine that powered the prosperity of the entire tribe. A stingy king was not just a bad king. He was a clog in the flow of cosmic good fortune, a source of blight upon the land. Bress was the very personification of stinginess. He was a black hole of generosity. The moment he took power, a chilling quiet fell over the great halls of Tara. The roaring fires in the hearths, which should have been welcoming beacons, were allowed to dwindle to smoldering embers. The great feast ceased. Under Bress's rule, the chronicle tells us, their knives were not greased by his food, and their breath did not smell of ale at his feast. The cauldron of the Dagda, that magnificent treasure of endless plenty, the ultimate symbol of royal hospitality, was put aside and used and cold. This was not merely poor policy, it was a spiritual crime. But Bress's tyranny went beyond mere miserliness. He began to actively oppress and humiliate the very gods who had won him his kingdom. He imposed immense and burdensome taxes on the chieftains, demanding their finest jewels, their most prized cattle, their most beautiful treasures. But unlike a true king, who would then redistribute this wealth among the people, Bress hoarded it all for himself and for his Fomorian relatives, who now began to arrive in Ireland, treating it as their own personal treasury. His insults grew more personal and more profound. He took the Dagda, the good god, a being of immense power, the lord of life and death, and put him to work as a common stonemason, forcing him to build forts and dig trenches. The Dagda, in his weary state, was given only minimal rations, a deep insult to the god whose own cauldron could feed the world. He likewise humiliated Goibniu, the master smith, the genius whose magical forge had armed them for victory. Bress treated him not as a master artisan, but as a menial laborer, forcing him to perform common smithy tasks and denying him the respect due to his divine skill. He took the very pillars of Tuatha Dé society, their greatest warrior god, and their master craftsmen, and treated them like slaves. The land itself began to suffer under this blight of a king. The songs of the bards and the harpers fell silent, for with no generosity to reward them, there was no inspiration for their art. And without the magical life-affirming power of their music and poetry, a subtle decay began to set in. The crops grew less full. The cattle grew thin. A spiritual malaise, a direct result of the king's miserable spirit, settled over the once golden kingdom. The Tuatha Dé, a proud and brilliant people, were being slowly starved, not just of food, but of the joy, art, and light that defined their very existence. They had won a great war against a noble enemy only to find themselves enslaved by an ignoble one of their own making. The tyranny of Bress could not last. The breaking point came not from a warrior's sword, but from a poet's words. In the society of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a poet was a figure of immense power and prestige. The Fili, the poet-seer, was more than an entertainer. He was a guardian of history, a prophet, and a conduit of magical power. To honor a poet was to honor the soul of the tribe. To insult one was to invite disaster. A wandering poet of great renown, a man named Quarper, arrived at Bress's court at Tara. According to the sacred laws of hospitality, he should have been welcomed with open arms. He should have been given the seat of honor, bathed, clothed in fine linen, and served the best food and drink the court had to offer, before being sent on his way with a generous gift. This was the inviolable custom. Bress, in his arrogance and greed, shattered it. Quarper was not welcomed into the great hall. He was shuffled off to a tiny, dark, and windowless hut. There was no fire to warm him, no soft bed to sleep on. After a long wait, a servant brought him his meal, 3 small dry cakes of bread, served on a plate so small it could barely hold them. It was the most profound and calculated insult imaginable. It was a declaration that in the court of Brest the Beautiful, the arts of the spirit were worthless. Quarper ate the dry cakes in his cold, dark room. That night he did not sleep. He composed. He wove his anger, his humiliation, and the full force of his magical poetic power into a short, blistering verse. The next morning, he stood before Brest and uttered the first satire ever spoken in Ireland. The poem was a masterpiece of concise magical insult. Without food quickly on a dish, without a cow's milk on which a calf grows, without a man's abode in the gloom of night, without paying a company of storytellers, let that be the condition of Brest. In our modern world, these might seem like mere clever words, a bad review. But in the world of the Tuatha day, the words of a true poet had the force of a physical spell. A satire was a curse, and it struck its target with supernatural power. The moment the words were spoken, Brest's reign was over. The magical curse of the poet manifested itself physically. The king's famously handsome face, the very basis of his name, broke out in ugly red blemishes and boils. Brest the Beautiful was beautiful no more. He was now blemished, imperfect. And by the same sacred law that had disqualified Tuatha, Brest was now unfit to be king. The lie of his inner ugliness was now written on his outer skin for all to see. There was no argument, no debate. His authority evaporated in an instant. Deposed and disgraced, he was exiled from Tara. Furious, his handsome face now a mask of shame and rage, Brest did not seek solace among his father's people. He knew he would find no sympathy there. Instead, he fled across the sea, to the dark, watery kingdoms of his mother's kin. He journeyed to Lachlan, the mythical undersea homeland of the Fomorians, and there he stood before the terrifying throne of his maternal grandfather. This was Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor was the most powerful and most feared of all the Fomorian kings. He was a titan of destruction, a being whose power bordered on the apocalyptic. He had a single massive eye in the center of his forehead, an eye that was so venomous, so filled with a poison of pure annihilation, that it was kept permanently shut, its lid held down by 7 heavy, overlapping layers of leather and iron. It was said that as a child, he had spied on his father's druids as they were brewing a spell of death, and the magical fumes from the cauldron had entered his eye, granting it its lethal power. The gaze of Balor's eye, when it was finally unleashed, could wither a whole army into dust and blight the very land so that nothing would ever grow there again. Brest stood before Balor and his other monstrous uncle, Indech, the son of the deep goddess, and he told them his story. He spoke of his humiliation, of the riches of Ireland, and he begged them to grant him an army so he could reclaim his throne and punish the Tuatha de Danann. Balor listened, his single eye remaining shut, but a slow, terrible smile spreading across his monstrous face. He saw not the plea of his grandson, but an opportunity. For years, the Fomorians had been content to merely raid Ireland for tribute. Now, with a pretext for a full-scale war and a guide who knew all the secrets of the Tuatha Dé, he could finally launch an invasion to conquer the island completely, enslave its people, and claim its riches for the Fomorian Empire once and for all. He agreed to Brest's request. He began to summon his champions from every dark corner of the undersea world, to gather the full monstrous might of the Fomorian race. A great dark tide was beginning to gather, a storm of chaos and destruction that was preparing to break upon the shores of Ireland. Meanwhile, back at Tara, the Tuatha de Danann rejoiced at the fall of the tyrant. They immediately set about righting the great wrong that had been done to their true king. Their master physician Diensecht, aided by the metalsmith Credn, had constructed a miraculous prosthetic for Tuatha. It was an arm of pure, shining silver, perfectly articulated, allowing Tuatha to move his fingers and wield his sword as if it were made of flesh and bone. With this, Tuatha of the Silver Arm, as he was now known, was deemed whole enough to rule. But even this incredible feat of magical medicine was not enough for Diensecht's own son, Mayak. He believed he could do better. He found Tuatha's original severed arm, and through a long and arduous ritual of magic and healing, chanting spells over it for 3 days and 3 nights, he managed to reattach the arm of flesh and blood to Tuatha's shoulder, making it as good as new. Tuatha was truly whole once more. Dian's sect, in a fit of jealous rage that his son's skill had surpassed his own, tragically slew Mayak, but the deed was done. Tuatha, his body and his honor restored, took his rightful place back upon the throne of Tara. The feasting halls were opened, the fires were lit, the songs of the poets once again filled the air, and prosperity began to return to the land. But even as they celebrated, they could feel a cold wind blowing from the sea. They knew what Bress had done, and they knew what was coming. The Fomorian storm was gathering. A war was imminent. A war that would make their struggle against the Furbolg look like a mere skirmish. They were facing an army of monsters led by a king whose gaze was death itself. They had their rightful king back, but they knew they needed more. They needed a champion, a hero of destiny, to lead them through the coming night. And as if in answer to their silent prayers, a new light was about to appear in the west, a hero who carried the blood of both peoples in his veins. The land of Ireland breathed again. With the tyrant Bress deposed and their rightful king, Tuatha of the Silver Arm, restored to the throne, the Tuatha de Danann had begun to heal. The fires in the feasting halls of Tara burned bright once more. The poetry flowed, and the divine generosity that was the lifeblood of their kingdom pulsed through the land. On the surface, the Golden Age had returned, but it was a fragile peace, a sunlit moment beneath the shadow of a gathering storm. Every whisper on the wind from the east carried with it the salt tang of the sea and the cold dread of the Fomorians. They knew that the disgraced Bress had fled to his mother's people. They knew of the monstrous power of Balor of the Evil Eye. They knew that a war was coming, a war that would dwarf their conflict with the Furbolg, a war that would be a struggle for the very soul of their world. They had a king, but they needed a savior. They had skill, but they needed a miracle. And as the gods of Ireland sat in grim council at the great royal seat on the hill of Tara, a miracle arrived at their gates. The hill of Tara was the heart of the kingdom, the symbolic center of the world. And its great feasting hall was the most exclusive club in existence. King Tuatha had established a strict law. No one could gain entry to the hall unless they were a master of a specific art or skill, be it craftsmanship, warfare, music, magic, or medicine. This was not an act of arrogance, but a declaration of purpose. Tara was to be a repository of all excellence, a shining beacon of every skill and talent brought to its highest perfection. Only the best were permitted entry. As Tuatha and the chief gods of the Tuatha Deth mighty Dagda, the smith Goibniu, the physician Dien sect debated their war strategy, a sentry brought word of a new arrival. A young warrior had appeared at the gates, leading a small, armed retinue. He was described as being impossibly handsome, with a face that shone like the rising sun, so radiant that it was difficult to look upon him directly. He was dressed in the raiment of a king, and he carried himself with an authority that belied his youth. The gatekeeper, a man named Kamal, went to the gate and challenged the newcomer according to the law. "Who are you?" he demanded. "And what is the art you practice? For no one without a specific skill may enter the gates of Tara." The young warrior's voice was clear and resonant, filled with a calm, unshakable confidence. "I am Luff Lamfata," he announced. "Luff of the Long Arm, and I am a right." The gatekeeper scoffed. "We have no need of you," he replied. "We already have a right in our midst, a man named Lukta Mac Luchade." Luff was unfazed. "Then I am a smith." The gatekeeper laughed. "A smith? We have the greatest smith the world has ever known, Goibniu himself, whose forgecraft is a thing of legend. We have no need of another." "Then," said Luff, his gaze steady, "I am a champion. Tara is filled with champions." The gatekeeper retorted dismissively. "Agma himself is our champion. a god of strength and eloquence. This extraordinary interview continued. Luff, with an almost divine patience, began to list his accomplishments, offering each one as a key to the gate. "I am a harpist," he declared. "We have a harpist," the gatekeeper countered. "Apian Mac by Selmois. I am a hero of valor. We have many of those. I am a poet and a historian. They are plentiful here. I am a sorcerer. Our druids and magicians are powerful and numerous. I am a physician. We have Dien Sect, the father of all healing. I am a cupbearer. We have cupbearers. I am a craftsman in bronze and gold. We have artists who can shape metal like clay." For every single skill and art that defined the Tuatha De Danann, Luff claimed mastery. And for every claim the gatekeeper had a retort, for Terra truly was the home of the masters. Seemed an impasse. Any other person would have been turned away in failure. But Luff was not any other person. He gathered himself and delivered his final irrefutable challenge, the statement that would shatter the gates of precedence and change the destiny of his people. His voice rang out, no longer a request but a declaration of power. "Go to your king," he commanded the gatekeeper, "and ask him this one question. Does he have within his court any single man who is a master of all of these arts combined? For if he has such a man, then I have no need to enter Terra. I will turn and leave this place." The gatekeeper was stunned into silence. He realized he was not speaking to a boastful youth, but to something else entirely. He hurried into the great hall and stood before King Tuatha, relaying the extraordinary challenge that had been issued at his gate. A hush fell over the assembled gods. They looked at each other in astonishment. A master of one art was a great blessing. A master of two was a marvel. But a master of all of them? Such a being was unheard of, a living embodiment of the totality of their culture. Tuatha, a wise and thoughtful king, was intrigued. "Let this man in," he commanded. "A man of such quality has never before come to this fortress. The welcome of Ireland is before him." But Ogma, the champion of the Tuatha De, a god of immense strength, was skeptical. He sought to test this newcomer's claims. Ogma went to the great unmovable flagstone that sealed the entrance to the hall, a stone that required the strength of 80 oxen to shift. He hoisted it up and hurled it outside as a challenge. Luff, with no apparent effort, picked up the massive stone and hurled it back, setting it perfectly into its frame, repairing the gate his challenger had broken. Luff then strode into the hall of Terra. The assembled gods fell silent, their eyes wide with awe. It was as if the sun had walked into the room. His presence was a palpable force, a concentration of pure skill and light. King Tuatha, deeply impressed, motioned for him to take a seat. But Luff did not sit among the common warriors. He walked directly to the Forad na Fian, the sage's chair, the seat reserved for the chief Alim, the wisest counselor and historian of the kingdom. It was a seat of immense honor, and he took it as if by right. Ogma, still seeking to test him, challenged him to a game of Fitchell, the intricate and difficult board game of the Celtic kings. The board was set up, and Luff proceeded to systematically and brilliantly defeat the champion, employing strategies so advanced that Ogma could only watch in stunned admiration. Luff was so masterful that this specific, winning strategy became known forever after as Luff's game. Having witnessed this display of intellect, King Tuatha now wished to see his artistic skill. He called for the great harp of the Dagda to be brought forth. Luff took the massive instrument into his hands. His fingers touched the strings, and a silence of profound anticipation fell over the hall. Then he began to play. And as he played, he wove the 3 legendary strains of bardic magic, the highest and most powerful art of the harpist. First he played the Galtri, the sorrowful strain. A music of such heartbreaking sadness filled the hall that all the gods and warriors, great and powerful beings who had faced monsters and death without flinching, began to weep uncontrollably. They cried for all the losses they had ever suffered, for the beauty of things that fade, for the fundamental tragedy of existence. Then Luff shifted his melody. He played the giantri, the laughing strain. The music became light, joyous, and intoxicatingly merry. The tears of the gods dried instantly, replaced by gales of helpless, side-splitting laughter. The great hall of Tara, which had just been a chamber of sorrow, now echoed with a thunderous, unrestrained joy that shook the very rafters. Finally, as the laughter subsided, Luff changed his tune one last time. He began to play the Suantri, the sleeping strain. A melody of incredible peace and gentleness flowed from the harp strings, a sound like the quiet lapping of water on a distant shore. A deep and profound peace settled over the court. One by one, from the king on his throne to the lowest servant by the door, their heads began to nod. The entire hall fell into a deep, restful, and dreamless slumber that would last for 24 hours. When they awoke, all doubt had vanished. This was no mere champion. This was a force of destiny. They called him the Ildenak, the master of all arts. And they called him Lamphada, the long arm, a name that signified his ability to reach out and skillfully affect any domain he chose, be it war, art, or magic. And then they learned his lineage, the secret that made him not just a champion, but the living answer to their prayers. His father was Kian, a prince of the Tuatha de Danann, but his mother was Ethniu, the daughter of none other than Balor of the Evil Eye himself. There was a prophecy, long spoken of among the Fomorians, that Balor would one day be slain by his own grandson. Balor, in an attempt to avert this fate, had locked his daughter Ethniu away in a high tower on Tory Island, to keep her from ever meeting a man. But Kian of the Tuatha De, with the help of a druidess, had managed to reach her. Luff was the child of that secret union. He was, like the disgraced Bress, a child of two bloods. But where Bress was the embodiment of the worst of both races, the greed of the Fomorians and the entitlement of the Tuatha De Luff was the perfect synthesis of the best. He possessed all the light, skill, artistry, and intellectual brilliance of his father's people, but within him also lay the primal, indomitable, and world-shaping power of his mother's kin. He was the bridge between the two worlds, the one being who truly understood both sides, and therefore the only one who could truly defeat the Fomorians. King Tuatha, looking upon this shining youth, this walking embodiment of divine perfection, understood his own role with a profound and humble wisdom. He knew that while he was the rightful king, Luff was the destined savior. A great king knows when to lead, but a greater king knows when to step aside. Tuatha stood up from his throne. He addressed the assembled court, and his voice was firm. "It is clear to me," he announced, "that this man Luff is the one destined to lead us through the coming darkness. He has the strength of all of us combined within his single person." And then, in an act of unprecedented humility and strategic genius, King Tuatha abdicated his throne. He declared that for a period of 13 days, Luff would hold the kingship of Ireland. He would sit on the throne, command the armies, and have the full authority to organize the Tuatha De Danann for the war that was to come. Luff, the master of all arts, accepted the charge. The boy who had arrived at the gate as a stranger now sat upon the throne of Tara, the hopes of a nation resting on his young shoulders. The coming of Luff was a turning point. The despair that had haunted the Tuatha De was replaced by a new and burning hope. They had been a collection of masters. Now, under the command of the master of all arts, they were about to become a perfectly orchestrated army. The Fomorian storm could come. They would be ready. The stage was set for the final epic confrontation, the great second battle of Mag Tuired. The 13 days of Luff's temporary kingship were over. But in that short time, the entire spirit of the Tuatha De Danann had been reforged. Hope had been hammered into resolve, and skill had been organized into a symphony of war. Love had taken a collection of brilliant individuals and transformed them into a single, cohesive force, every part working in perfect harmony. And his timing was impeccable, for on the horizon the sea itself seemed to boil. The Fomorian storm had finally broken. They came on a tide of darkness and fury. The chronicles say that the fleet of the Fomorians was so vast that it was a day's journey to sail from one end of it to the other. Their ships were monstrous, misshapen things, propelled by means other than wind or oar. They landed on the northwestern shores, and the land itself groaned under their weight. This was not an army as men would understand it. It was a tide of monstrosity, a convocation of every nightmare that lurked in the cold abyssal depths. There were hulking giants whose footfalls shook the earth, warriors with the heads of goats and bulls, and champions whose bodies were a grotesque mockery of the human form. And at their head, a figure of absolute terror, was Balor of the Evil Eye. He did not march as other kings. He was carried upon a great dark throne, his single eye sealed shut beneath its 7 heavy lids, but the very air around him crackled with a palpable aura of annihilation. Alongside him was the disgraced Bress, his face still twisted with a bitter desire for revenge, and the other Fomorian lords, their forms a catalogue of primal chaos. They had come not just to reclaim a throne for Bress, but to extinguish the light of the Tuatha Day forever and plunge Ireland into an age of darkness and tribute. Against this tide of horror, the host of the Tuatha Day Danann assembled. They were fewer in number, but they were a vision of light and order. Their armor shone like the sun, their spears were a forest of lethal points, and their faces were filled with a grim, luminous courage. Luff of the Long Arm rode before them, no longer the boy at the gate, but a god of war, his presence a beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. The battlefield was to be the same as the last, the plain of Mag Twyard. But this was not to be a mere sequel to the first battle. That had been a war for a kingdom. This was to be a war for the world. Before the battle was joined, Luff rode through the ranks of his army, and he did not give a typical speech of courage and glory. Instead, he addressed each of the great artisans of his people, the architects of their victory, reminding them and all who listened of the unique power they held. This was to be a battle won not by brute force, but by the perfect application of divine skill. He rode to Goibniu, the master smith, who stood beside a great, roaring forge that had been magically erected on the battlefield. "What power will you bring to us in this great battle, Goibniu?" Luff asked, his voice ringing out for all to hear. Goibniu raised his hammer and declared, "I promise this, King of the Shining Host. For every spear that shatters and every sword that breaks in a warrior's hand, I will forge a new one in 3 strokes of my hammer. These new weapons will never miss their mark, and the wounds they inflict can never be healed. We will never be disarmed." Luff then rode to Dien Sect, the master physician, who stood beside a spring whose waters he had blessed with every healing herb in Ireland. "And you, Dien Sect, what power do you offer?" The physician gestured to the well. "This spring shall be our salvation. Any warrior of the Tuatha Day who is wounded in the fray, so long as his head is not severed from his body, can be plunged into these waters. He will emerge whole and hale, his wounds vanished, ready to return to the fight as if he had never been touched." This magical well became known as the Well of Slain, the Well of Health. He continued through the ranks, his questions weaving a spell of confidence. He spoke to the sorcerers who promised to hide the rivers and lakes of Ireland from the Fomorians, so their enemies would be maddened with thirst, while ensuring the Tuatha Day would always have water. They also promised to rain down showers of fire on the Fomorian host. He spoke to the cupbearers who swore the Tuatha Day would never feel thirst. And he spoke to the Dagda, the good god, who stood leaning on his colossal club. The Dagda, with a grim smile, promised that he would fight with the strength of the earth itself, that his club would break the bones of the Fomorian kings like brittle twigs, and that his magic would confound and terrify their armies. With these promises made, every warrior knew that they were part of an invincible system. They had an endless supply of magical weapons, a source of infinite healing, and the support of the most powerful magicians and gods in existence. Fear was replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. They were ready. The battle began. It was a maelstrom of chaos and light. The howls of the Fomorian monsters were met with the clear, ringing battle cries of the Tuatha Dé. The air became thick with flying spears, magical fire, and the screams of the dying. The Tuatha Dé fought with a coordinated fury, their lines moving with the grace of dancers, their magical weapons finding their marks again and again. When a warrior fell wounded, his comrades would carry him to the Well of Slain, and he would return to the battle moments later, good as new. When a sword shattered, the warrior would retreat to Goibnia's forge and return with the new, even deadlier blade. The Fomorians, who fought with brute strength and overwhelming numbers, were baffled and enraged by this resilient, almost immortal army. They would cut down a Tuatha Dé champion, only to see him running back into the fray minutes later. The Dagda was a force of nature upon the field. His great club, the Lorg Mor, rose and fell, and with every swing it was said he killed 9 Fomorians, their bones turning to pulp. He strode through their ranks like a farmer walking through a field of wheat, leaving a trail of broken bodies in his wake. He also unleashed his magical harp, playing the Galtri to fill the Fomorian hearts with a debilitating sorrow, and the Giantri to make them laugh uncontrollably in the middle of a charge, rendering them helpless. But the Fomorians had their own dark power, and they began to push back. They sent their own sorcerers to find the Well of Slain and fill it with stones, choking off the Tuatha Dé's source of healing. The battle turned into a brutal slog, a war of attrition, and it was then that the first great tragedy of the day struck. Tuatha of the Silver Arm, the restored king, fighting with the courage that had first won him the island, pushed too far into the enemy ranks. He found himself cut off and surrounded, and then he came face to face with the dark throne of Balor. The Fomorian tyrant, seeing the king of the Tuatha Dé before him, gave a terrible command. "Lift my eyelid, my servants," he croaked, "that I may see the man who speaks with me." His attendants, using great hooks of bronze, began the slow, terrible process of prying open the 7 heavy lids that sealed his eye. A dark, crimson light began to leak from between the lids. Tuatha knew he was doomed. He fought to break free, but it was too late. The final lid was lifted. The full, annihilating gaze of Balor's eye fell upon Tuatha. For a single silent moment, the king of the Tuatha Dé was bathed in that venomous light, and then he simply ceased to be, incinerated into a pile of fine white ash. A terrible cry of despair rose from the Tuatha Dé host. Their king was dead. Their source of healing was gone. The momentum of the battle shifted entirely. The Fomorians, roaring in triumph, surged forward, and it seemed that the light of the Tuatha Dé was about to be extinguished forever. But as despair threatened to overwhelm them, a new light appeared at the front of the battle. It was Luff of the Long Arm. His face was no longer that of the handsome youth, but the terrible luminous mask of a war god. He knew that the fate of his people, the fate of the world itself, now rested on his shoulders. He cast off his armor, freeing himself for speed and movement, and began to circle the battlefield on one foot, with one Iklosita magical posture designed to focus immense power. He chanted incantations as he moved, bolstering the courage of his own troops and striking fear into the hearts of the enemy. Then, he made his way directly towards the center of the Fomorian host, directly towards his grandfather, Balor. He came to a halt before the great dark throne. The Titan of Destruction and the young god of light faced each other across the blood-soaked field. Balor, seeing this new shining challenger, gave the same dreadful command. "Lift my eye," he boomed, "so that I may see this chattering upstart." Again, the servants began their grim work, prying open the 7 heavy lids. Luff stood his ground unafraid. He had a weapon, but it was not a great sword or a mighty spear. It was a simple sling. As the lids were peeled back one by one, and the deadly red glow of the eye intensified, Luff calmly took a stone, some say it was a tathlum, a magical missile made from the blood of vipers and the brains of bears, and placed it in his sling. The Fomorian attendants pulled back the seventh and final lid. The full world-ending power of Baelor's eye was unleashed, a beam of pure annihilation that lanced across the field towards Luff. But in that same instant, Luff spun his sling once above his head and let the stone fly. The stone flew with the speed of a sunbeam and the accuracy of a god's will. It met the gaze of Baelor's eye head-on. It did not shatter. It struck the eye like a thunderbolt, driving the venomous orb itself backwards, straight through the back of Baelor's own skull. The result was an apocalypse of self-destruction. The gaze of the eye, still blazing with its full power, was now turned inward, upon the Fomorian army itself. The beam of death scythed through their own ranks, turning their greatest champions to dust, melting their monstrous beasts into slag, and carving a great smoking crater through the heart of their host. The screams of the Fomorians were terrible as they were consumed by their own ultimate weapon. Baelor, the great tyrant, slumped forward on his throne, slain by his own power, a victim of the very prophecy he had tried to escape. The death of their king and the terrifying spectacle of his power turned against them shattered the Fomorian army completely. Their morale, their formations, their very will to fight, evaporated in an instant. It was a total rout. The Tuatha De Danann, filled with the renewed and furious courage, surged forward. Luff, having retrieved the mighty spear of victory, was an unstoppable force, and the Dagdas Club continued its grim work. They pursued the fleeing Fomorians all the way to the coast, slaughtering them on the beaches as they tried to scramble back to their ships. The victory was total. It was absolute. The power of the Fomorians was broken, their king was dead, and their threat to Ireland was ended for all time. The Tuatha De Danann had faced the ultimate darkness and had emerged into the light, victorious. They had paid a terrible price, losing their king Nuada and countless warriors. But they had secured their world. Their golden age, earned through skill, courage, and the brilliance of their destined champion, could now truly begin, free from the shadow of war. Or so they believed. The last of the Fomorian ships had vanished beneath the waves. A broken fleet carrying a broken people back into the abyssal darkness from whence they came. The field of Mag Twyard was silent, save for the wind whistling over the newly raised burial mounds of kings and warriors. The great cosmic war was over. The forces of chaos, darkness, and monstrous nature had been utterly defeated. The Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, were the undisputed sole masters of the Isle of Ireland. And so began their golden age. With Luff of the Long Arm as their king, a true peace descended upon the land. It was an era of unparalleled splendor, a time that would be burned into the memory of the land itself as a period of almost perfect existence. The arts flourished as never before. The music of the Dagdas harp filled the air, and the poetry of the bards was sublime. The forges of Goibniu produced not weapons, but objects of breathtaking beauty. The cauldron of the Dagda ensured that no one ever knew hunger, and the land itself seemed to rejoice under the stewardship of its divine masters. The harvests were always bountiful, the rivers teemed with salmon, and the cows were heavy with milk. It was a kingdom of light, skill, magic, and plenty, the final realization of the dream they had carried from their 4 northern cities. They ruled for generations in this idyllic state. But in the great turning wheel of ages, no age lasts forever. The sun of the Tuatha De Danann's reign had reached its zenith, and now, imperceptibly at first, it was beginning to set. A new power was stirring in the world. A new race of men was turning its gaze towards the shining Emerald Isle, and their coming would herald a change more profound and more final than any war with monsters. They were not a force of chaos. They were a force of history, and they would not defeat the gods with weapons, but with words, with logic, and with an entirely new definition of reality. They were the Milesians, the sons of Mila, Spain. The story of the Milesians begins far to the south, in the land of Brigantia, in what is now modern-day Spain. Here a great king named Briagan had built a massive tower, so tall that it seemed to scratch the heavens. One clear winter's evening, his son Ith climbed to the very top of this tower and looked out across the sea. In the far northern distance, through the crisp, clear air, he saw a sliver of green on the horizon. He saw, as if through a magical lens, the island of Ireland, shimmering in the twilight like a promised land. Intrigued by this vision, Ith gathered a ship and a company of warriors and set sail to investigate this mysterious island. When he landed, he found a land that was beautiful but in turmoil. Luff was long dead, and the kingship had passed to 3 grandsons of the Dagda Mac Quill. Mac Sect and Mac Grainho ruled jointly with their 3 wives, the goddesses Eriu, Bamba, and Fadla. The 3 kings were quarreling amongst themselves over the division of the kingdom's treasures. Ith, a wise and just man, was asked to mediate their dispute. He was so overcome by the beauty and richness of the land that he praised it lavishly, urging the 3 kings to cease their bickering and rule their magnificent island with the wisdom it deserved. But his praise was his undoing. The 3 kings grew suspicious. They saw the longing in Ith's eyes and believed he had come not as a mediator, but as a scout with ambitions to conquer their fertile land. In a flagrant violation of the laws of hospitality, they ambushed and mortally wounded Ith as he was returning to his ship. His men managed to get him back on board, but he died during the journey home. When his body was brought back to Spain, and his son Mila Spain saw what had been done, a terrible grief and anger filled him and his people. The murder of Ith was an unforgivable crime that demanded vengeance. But it was more than that. It was now a sacred duty. The vision from the tower was not just a curiosity, it was a prophecy. That beautiful green land was their destiny. They began to prepare a great invasion fleet, not just to avenge a death, but to claim a birthright. The Milesian fleet, led by the sons of Mil and their chief poet, druid and judge, a man of immense power named Amergin Gluangel, finally arrived on the shores of Ireland. Their ships were filled with disciplined warriors, men whose worldview was shaped by lineage, law, and a sense of historical destiny. As they began to make their way inland, they were met by the 3 great queens of the Tuatha de Danann, the goddess queens for whom the land was named. First they met Bamba. She greeted them with a host of magical warriors, and asked that they do her the honor of naming the island after her should they be victorious. Amergin, with a poet's grace, agreed. A little further on they met Fadla, who made the same request, and again Amergin consented. Finally, at the sacred hill of Usnich, the mystical center of the island, they met the greatest of the 3 queens, Eriu. Her presence was one of profound power and sorrow. She, too, prophesied their victory but begged them to name the land after her, so that her spirit would forever be tied to its soil. Amergin, recognizing her power, gave her his solemn word. And so it is that the island is called Ireland from Eriu, but Bamba and Fadla remain as its poetic names, a final honor paid to its last divine queens. The Tuatha Dé, however, had no intention of simply surrendering their kingdom. They were still masters of magic, and they unleashed their power upon the invaders. They used their sorcery, their druidect, to cast powerful illusions. They made it seem as if the island did not exist at all, so the Milesian ships could not find it. When that failed, they made the land appear as nothing more than the back of a giant, monstrous pig, the swine of the mists. They summoned phantom armies that charged at the Milesians, only to dissolve into smoke. But the Milesians had their own great power at their disposal, the druidic magic of Amergin. He was a poet-seer of the highest order, and his vision was clear. He saw through their illusions. He chanted counterspells that peeled away the phantom armies and revealed the true green land beneath. The magic of the Tuatha Dé for the first time had met its match. A battle was fought at Slavic Leshy, and the Tuatha Dé were defeated, but it was not a decisive, overwhelming victory like the one at Mag Tuatha. The Milesians lost many warriors, and even one of the sons of Mil was slain. It became clear that a war of attrition against a race that was effectively immortal would be long and costly. The conflict had reached a stalemate. It could not be won by force of arms alone. It would have to be decided by a battle of will, of magic, and of law. The two hosts agreed to a truce. The Tuatha Dé proposed a judgment. Let the matter be decided by their law. The Milesians agreed, but insisted that the judge be Amergin, for they did not trust the judgment of their enemies. Amergin, standing between the two peoples, prepared to make a ruling that would change the course of history. The Tuatha Dé argued that the Milesians had landed by stealth, under cover of darkness, and that this was an illegal invasion. They should leave the island at once. Amergin considered this. Then he gave his extraordinary judgment. The judgment is fair, he declared. The Milesians would obey. They would return to their ships. They would retreat from the shore a distance of 9 waves, a measurement of immense magical significance, the symbolic boundary between one world and the next. If you can land again, Amergin proclaimed to the Tuatha Dé, despite our opposition, then the island is yours. But if we can land again despite yours, then the island is ours. It was a test, a trial by ordeal on a national scale. The Tuatha Dé, confident in their absolute mastery over the elements of their own island, readily agreed. The Milesians boarded their ships and sailed back out to sea, beyond the mystical boundary of the 9th wave. The moment the Milesian fleet crossed the 9th wave, the Tuatha Dé unleashed the full, terrifying force of their magic. Their druids stood upon the cliffs and chanted, summoning the very elements to their aid. A mighty and unnatural storm arose. The sky turned black. The wind howled like 1,000 banshees, tearing at the sails of the Milesian ships. The sea itself rose up in monstrous, churning waves that threatened to splinter their hulls and drag them all down into the depths. This was not a natural storm. It was a weapon, the concerted will of a pantheon of gods directed at the utter annihilation of their enemies. The Milesian fleet was scattered, their warriors terrified. It seemed that the judgment had been a trick, a clever way to lure them to their doom in the open sea. But then, as the storm raged at its fiercest, Amergin Gluangel stood upon the prow of the lead ship. He was not a warrior now, but a druid in his full power. He faced the magical tempest and he began to speak. He did not shout commands or weave counterspells in the traditional sense. Instead, he spoke a great poem, an incantation of such profound elemental power that it has echoed down through the ages. It is known as the Song of Amergin. He did not fight the storm. He became the land that the storm was attacking. He identified himself, mystically and poetically, with the very fabric of Ireland. His voice rose above the howl of the wind as he chanted, I am the wind that blows upon the sea. I am the wave of the ocean. I am the murmur of the billows. I am the ox of the 7 combats. I am the vulture upon the rock. I am a tear of the sun. I am the fairest of flowers. I am the wild boar in valor. I am the salmon in the pool. I am the lake on the plain. I am the hill of poetry. I am a word of science. I am the point of the spear that gives battle. I am the god who creates in the head the fire. With each line, Amergin wove his own being, and by extension the being of his people, into the essence of Ireland. He was claiming ownership not by conquest, but by becoming one with the land itself. His magic was deeper, more fundamental than the storm magic of the Tuatha Dé, and it worked. As his words washed over the sea, the magical wind died. The churning waves grew calm. The storm, its power broken by a poem, abated. The sun broke through the black clouds. The way was clear. The Milesians regrouped and sailed back towards the shore, landing safely and without opposition. The Tuatha, watching from the cliffs, were stunned. Their greatest magic had failed. By the terms of their own agreement, by the judgment of the law they had agreed to, the island was lost. The war was over. The Milesians were the victors. The surviving sons of Mil met with the surviving kings of the Tuatha Danann to finalize the terms of the surrender. But Amergin, in his wisdom, knew that to simply annihilate or enslave the gods would be a hollow victory. He knew that their power was still immense, and that their spirit was inextricably linked with the land. So he made a final world-altering proposal. He would not banish them. He would not destroy them. He would honor them by dividing the world in two. He decreed that the sons of Mil, the mortal race of men, would take the world above. They would have dominion over the surface of Ireland, the soil, the fields, the forests, the physical world that could be plowed and built upon. This would be the world of history, of human law, of time and mortality. The Tuatha Danann, he decreed, would be given the other half of the world below. They would have dominion over the invisible magical reality that existed parallel to the physical one. Their kingdom would be the subterranean realm, accessible through the ancient mounds and stone portals that dotted the landscape. It was a poetic, brilliant, and tragic solution. The Tuatha were not being destroyed. They were being made redundant. They were being relegated from the position of gods who governed the world to the status of supernatural beings who haunted its hidden corners. Their age of open rule in the sunlight was over. Their new age of secret existence in the twilight was about to begin. The Tuatha, their power broken, their magic surpassed, and their era at a definitive end, accepted the terms. It was a treaty that ended not just a war, but an entire cosmic age. They prepared to retreat from the world of mortal men, to pass through the veil and take up their thrones in the hollow hills, forever trading the open sky for a kingdom of shadow and memory. The fating had begun. The treaty was sealed. The words of Amergin, which had calmed the sea, had now redefined the very fabric of reality. The world was cleaved in two. The age of myth, where gods walked openly under the sun, was over. The age of history, the age of mortal men, had begun. For the victorious Milesians, it was the dawn of a new era, a time to build kingdoms of stone and law upon the surface of the green earth. But for the defeated Tuatha Danann, it was the beginning of a long, strange, and beautiful twilight. It was the beginning of their afterlife. They were not slain. They were not cast into a pit of darkness like the titans of Greek myth. Their fate was something far more subtle, more poetic, and in many ways more tragic. They were to become a memory. They were to retreat from the world of substance and become the lords of the world of shadow. The gods of Ireland were about to become its fairies. The great host of the Tuatha Danann gathered one last time under the open sky. Their light, which had once been as radiant as the sun, now seemed softer, more diffuse, as if they were already beginning to fade. Their leaders, the great Dagda and the other surviving gods, now had to perform their final act as rulers of the old world. They had to divide their new invisible kingdom. The Dagda, the good god, whose wisdom was as great as his strength, took charge of the great partitioning. Their new kingdom was not a single unified land, but an archipelago of hidden realms, a network of palaces concealed from mortal eyes. The gateways to these realms were the most ancient and sacred sites in all of Ireland, the great burial mounds that had been raised by the peoples who came even before the Fir Bolg. These were the Sidhe, pronounced she, the hollow hills, the barrows and tumuli that dotted the landscape. From the outside, they were mere hills of earth and stone, but on the inside, they were now to be the portals to the magnificent, timeless palaces of the gods. The Dagda, like a king distributing fiefdoms, assigned a sit to each of the chief gods and nobles of the Tuatha. To Luff of the Long Arm, the savior of their people, was given a great palace. To Ogma the champion another. To Bod Dirge, a son of the Dagda who would become a great king in this new age, was given his own mound. And the Dagda himself took the most famous of all, the great mound of Brú Boinn, the palace on the river Boyne, a place so ancient that its origins were lost even to the gods. One by one, or in great shining companies, the Tuatha De Danann approached these mounds. And as mortals watched from a distance, they simply walked into them. They did not dig or open a door. They passed through the solid earth and stone as if it were mist, crossing the veil between the world we know and the world that lies alongside it. And as the last of their host vanished into the green hills, a great silence fell upon the land. The presence of the gods had been lifted from the surface of the world. The fading was complete. In that moment their very nature changed. They ceased to be the Tuatha De Danann, the great pantheon that governed the nation. They became the Aussi, the people of the mounds. This is the term by which they would be known for all the thousands of years to come. They became the fair folk, the good people, the gentry, the hidden nobility of Ireland. What was this new kingdom they inherited? It was not a grim underworld, not a land of the dead. It was a paradise, a realm of sublime and unending beauty. They called it, among other names, Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. In this hidden realm, time itself flowed differently. For the Aussi, it was a timeless present. The blight of aging was unknown. Sickness and decay could not enter. The flowers were always in bloom. The trees were always heavy with fruit, and a soft, magical light, neither sunlight nor moonlight, illuminated their palaces of crystal and gold. Here they feasted eternally from magical cauldrons, listened to music of unearthly beauty, and pursued their arts to an ever greater perfection. It was a world without death, without want, and without the burdens of history. But it was also a world without consequence, a world of stasis. In becoming immortal and unchanging, they had removed themselves from the great, dynamic, and often painful story of life itself. Their existence was now a beautiful, perfect, and unending dream. And like any dream, it was separated from the waking world by a fragile, but almost impassable barrier. The gateways were the Sidhi, the fairy mounds. But these doors were not always open. For most of the year the hills were just hills. But on certain nights, when the veil between the worlds grew thin at the liminal times of Samhain, Halloween, and Beltane May Day, the gates would swing open. On these nights the Aussi would ride forth from their mounds in great, glittering processions, their horses shod with silver, their bells tinkling with the magical sound. Mortals who were unfortunate or fortunate enough to witness these fairy hostings would be overcome with awe and terror. To be seen by the riders was to risk being captured and taken into their world forever. Though they were hidden, the Aussi did not sever all contact with the world they had lost. Their influence, their magic, and their memory continued to bleed through the veil, shaping the beliefs, the fears, and the folklore of the mortal men who now ruled their old kingdom. The great gods of legend slowly transformed into the fairy kings and queens of folklore. The Dagda, the powerful father god, became a more rustic, sometimes comical figure, but still a being of immense magical power. Lugh of the long arm, the glorious sun god and savior, sometimes became known as Lugh Cromain or Little Stooping Lugh, which is one of the proposed origins for the word leprechaun, a tragic demotion for a god of such stature, from a king of all arts to a jealously hoarding fairy cobbler. Manannán mac Lir, the great god of the sea, became the archetypal fairy king, the ruler of the paradisical otherworld islands. Their interactions with mortals became the basis for countless thousands of folk tales, each one a distant echo of their divine nature. They were known to be fiercely protective of their sacred sites. A farmer who dared to plow a field too close to a fairy mound, or cut down a lone hawthorn tree, a tree sacred to the fairies, would invite their wrath. His cattle would sicken and die. His crops would fail. He might be stricken with a sudden wasting illness. This was a faint echo of the old god's power, a reminder that to disrespect their space was still a perilous act. They were also known for their love of beauty and their desire for new life. Sometimes, a beautiful mortal woman or a handsome young man would catch the eye of one of the Tuatha. That person might be lured away by enchanting music or a vision of a beautiful stranger, following them to a fairy mound and disappearing inside, never to be seen again. They were taken to Tir na Nog to be a lover or espoused to one of the fair folk, granted eternal youth but forever lost to their family and their world. This is the origin of countless Irish tales of mortals being taken by the fairies. Most famously, they were known to steal human children and leave changelings in their place. This dark practice had its roots in two of their great desires: their need for new blood to refresh their static existence, and their envy of mortal souls and the human experience of life and death. A beautiful, healthy human baby might be snatched from its cradle and replaced by one of the Tuatha's own offspring, a sickly, withered, and constantly screaming creature that would bring ruin and heartbreak to its human family. Or in other tales, the changeling was not a fairy child, but an ancient, weary fairy who wished to experience a human death, and so swapped places with the infant. But their interaction was not always hostile. They could also be benevolent. A kind mortal who left out a bowl of milk or cream at night, a direct echo of the old offerings to the gods, might find their luck turning. Their cows would produce more milk. Their chores would seem to finish themselves. The Tuatha could be grateful patrons, rewarding the small kindnesses that acknowledged their hidden presence. And of course there were the great hero tales. Mortal heroes like Cuchulainn and Finn Mac Cumhaill often had one foot in the mortal world and one in the world of the Cid. They would be trained by fairy warrior women, armed with fairy weapons, or venture into the otherworld to win a great prize or a magical bride. In these stories, the Tuatha act as the keepers of the deep magic of the world, a source of power and wisdom that a mortal hero could tap into if he was worthy enough. Yet, for all the beauty of Tir na Nog, a profound and inescapable sadness permeates the story of the Tuatha. It is the tragedy of beings who have outlived their own relevance. They possess a perfect world, but it is a static world, a museum of their former glory. There are poignant tales of those who leave the otherworld. The most famous is the story of Oisin, a great poet and warrior who falls in love with Niamh of the golden hair, a princess of the Tuatha. He goes with her to Tir na Nog and lives there for what feels to him like 3 years of perfect happiness. But eventually, a deep homesickness for his own people, for the camaraderie of his old warrior band, begins to gnaw at him. Niamh, heartbroken, agrees to let him return for a visit. She gives him her magical white horse but warns him with the utmost severity. He must not, under any circumstances, let his feet touch the soil of Ireland. If he does, he can never return to her. Oisin rides back across the sea and returns to Ireland. But he is horrified by what he finds. The land is the same, but the people are completely different. They are small and weak, not the heroic race he remembers. He asks them about his father, Finn Mac Cumhaill, and his great warrior band, the Fianna. The people look at him in confusion and tell him that those are figures from ancient history, from stories told about giants who lived 300 years ago. In that moment, Oisin realizes that his 3 years in Tir na Nog were 3 centuries in the mortal world. Everyone he ever knew, everyone he ever loved is long dead. Their bones turn to dust. In his grief and shock, he sees a group of men struggling to move a large boulder. Taking pity on their weakness, he leans down from his horse to help them, but as he does so, the saddle girth breaks. He tumbles from the horse, and his feet touch the soil of his long-lost home. The instant he makes contact, the magic of Tir na Nog is shattered. The white horse vanishes, and in a single horrific moment the 300 years catch up with him. Oisin, the handsome, youthful warrior, withers into an ancient, blind, and decrepit old man, the last survivor of a heroic age, trapped in a world that no longer remembers him. It is the ultimate expression of the tragedy of the Tuatha. A perfect, timeless existence that comes at the price of being forever disconnected from the living, breathing, dying world. The story of the Tuatha De Danann's life after their defeat is the story of how a pantheon of gods becomes a whisper, a folk memory. They were driven underground not just into the hollow hills, but into the subconscious of a nation. They are a powerful and enduring testament to the idea that what is defeated is not always destroyed. What is lost is not always gone. It is merely hidden, waiting in the twilight places, just beyond the edges of our sight. They represent the magic that our rational world sought to pave over, the myth that our historical world sought to file away. But their persistence, in the form of fairy lore that has survived for thousands of years, shows that you cannot completely erase such a power. The belief in the Sea is the survival of the Tuatha De Danann. Every time someone tells a story of a changeling, avoids a fairy fort, or leaves an offering of milk, they are participating in the afterlife of these fallen gods. They are the ultimate symbols of a beautiful, glorious past that can never be reclaimed, but can never be fully forgotten. They are the music from an empty hill, the light on a distant bog, the memory of a time when the world was younger, more magical, and filled with a light that, though now hidden, has never truly been extinguished. And so, our journey through the mists of a forgotten time comes to a close. We have looked upon the face of a power that predates our own world, a being, a pantheon whose story is a testament to a different kind of reality. These are more than just tales of monsters or fables of bygone gods. They are allegories written in the language of myth for a fundamental shift in the world and in ourselves. The fading of these great powers represents the victory of the world we now know, a world of order, of reason, of history. It is the story of how humanity paved over the wild magic of the earth, how we replaced the fear of the unknown with the certainty of the map. In their tragic decline, we see the story of our own rise. We banished the old gods and the ancient spirits to the shadows so that we could stand, unblunted, in the full light of the sun. But in doing so, we lost something. We lost our connection to the deep magic of the world, our respect for the powers that sleep, but are not dead. The echoes of their reign are all around us, a persistent memory that the world is older, stranger, and more profound than our modern philosophies will allow. So whether you walk in the deep woods where the branches seem to watch you, or among the ancient hills that hum with a silent energy, remember these stories. Remember that our world is built upon the ruins of theirs, and that to be wise is to acknowledge the powers that we have displaced but never truly conquered. Thank you for joining us on this expedition into the archives of the lost. The stories of our world are deep, and they are guarded by the ghosts of forgotten ages. If you wish to continue these explorations with us, to uncover the lore that lies sleeping in the dark places of the earth, then please consider subscribing to the Eldritch Codex. Your support is the torch that allows us to venture further into the shadows. Share our work with those who you feel would appreciate the journey, and click the notification bell to ensure you are always summoned when a new chapter is opened. Until our paths cross again, walk with wonder, and listen to the silence between the old words. For it is there that the truth often lies.